О, а может быть попробовать «Любовь, деньги, рок-н-ролл» после Кармака, ну, который создатель Everlasting Summer. О, Blasters HD, спасибо тебе большое. Спасибо огромное. Спасибо большое. Окей, го смотреть. Тред себя на 2 ч. Зачем заходить на 2 ч? Типа не иронично. Будешь читать тонны текста? Не знаю. Ну, может быть, первые 5 минут я офну и сделаю рефанд, посмотрим. Я подумаю. Дать ссылку? Серьезно? Аукцион? Я не знаю. Не знаю, сегодня буду проводить или завтра. Я подумаю. Интересно Илону посмотреть. Да не, ну, типа люди в интернете. Those people. Так. Окей, послушаю про метаверс. Сколько там? На 20 минут от метаверса. Окей, если мне покажется, что метаверс, я вот не понимаю Кармака, а что он, и типа зачем это, я просто пропущу.
That would be, you make something amazing that people love and you make it better and better. And that's where I could say we could have gone back and followed a path kind of like that in the early days. If you just kind of take the same game, whether it's when Activision demonstrated that you could make Call of Duty every year, and not only is it not bad, people kind of love it, and it's very profitable. The idea that you could have taken something like that, take a great game, release a new version every year that lets the capabilities grow and expand to start saying it's like, okay.
Мне кажется, или YouTube что-то сделал с качеством? Ну, вроде бы не такое было.
The same game, whether
Кажется.
it's when Activision demonstrated that you could make Call of Duty every year, and not only is it not bad, people kind of love it, and it's very profitable. The idea that you could have taken something like that, take a great game, release a new version every year that lets the capabilities grow and expand to start saying it's like, okay, it's a game about running around and shooting things, but now you can have, bring your media into it. You can add persistence of social signs of life or whatever you want to add to it. I still think that's, quite a good position to take. And I think that while Meta is doing a bottoms-up capability approach with Horizon Worlds, where it's a fairly general purpose, creators can build whatever they want in their sort of thing, it's hard to compare and compete with something like Fortnite, which also has enormous amounts of creativity, even though it was not designed originally as a general purpose sort of thing. So we have examples on both sides. Me personally, I would have bet on trying to do entertainment, valuable destination first and expanding from there.
So can you imagine the thing that will be kind of, if we look back a couple of centuries from now and you think about the experiences that marked the singularity, the transition in where most of our world moved into virtual reality, what do you think those experiences will look like?
So I do think it's going to be kind of like the way the web slowly took over, where you're the frog in the pot of water that's slowly heating up, where having lived through all of that, I remember when it was shocking to start seeing the first website address on a billboard, when you're like, hey, my computer world is infecting the real world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is spreading out in some way. But there's still, when you look back and say, well, what made the web take off? And it wasn't a big bang sort of moment there. It was a bunch of little things that turned out not to even be the things that are relevant now that brought them into it. So
Well, I wonder if like you said, you're not a historian. So maybe there's a historian out there that could really identify that moment, data-driven way. It could be like MySpace or something like that. Maybe the first major social network that really reached into non-geek world or something like that.
I think that's kind of the fallacy of historians, though, looking for some of those kind of primary dominant causes where so many of these things are like, we see an exponential curve, but it's not because like one thing is going exponential. It's because we have hundreds of little sigmoid curves overlapped on top of each other, and they just happen to keep adding up so that you've got something kind of going exponential at any given point. But no single one of them was the critical thing. There were, dozens and dozens of things. I mean, seeing the transitions of stuff like as obviously MySpace giving way to other things, but even like blogging giving way to social media and getting resurrected in other guises and
the memes
things
with
that
the
happened there.
Dancing baby gif or whatever, the all your base now belong to us, whatever those early memes that led to the modern memes, and the humor on the different evolution of humor on the internet that I'm sure the historians will also write books about, from the different websites that create the infrastructure for that humor, like Reddit and all that kind of stuff.
So people will go back and they will name firsts and critical moments, but it's probably going to be a poor approximation of what actually happens. And we've already seen, like in the VR space, where it didn't play out the way we thought it would in terms of what was going to be like the modern era of VR basically started with my E3 demo of Doom 3 on the Rift prototype. So we're like, first person shooters in VR, match made in heaven, right? Mm-hmm. And that didn't work out that way at all. They have the most comfort problems with it. And then the most popular virtual reality app is Beat Saber, which nobody predicted back then.
What's that make you, from first principles, if you were to like reverse engineer that? Why are these like silly fun games
It actually makes very clear sense when you analyze it from hindsight and look at the engineering reasons, where it's not just that it was a magical, quirky idea. It was something that played almost perfectly to what turned out to be the real strengths of VR, where the one thing that I really underestimated importance in VR was the importance of the controllers. I was still thinking we could do a lot more with the gamepad, and just the amazingness of taking any existing...
На самом деле, то, как VR еще работает, в нынешнем его виде, проще, когда вещи идут на тебя, чем ты идешь на вещи. То есть это просто проще контролировать.
Game, being able to move your head around and look around, that was really amazing. But the controllers were super important. But the problem is, so many things that you do with the controllers just suck. It feels like it breaks the illusion, like trying to pick up glasses with the controllers, where you're like, oh, use the grip button when you're kind of close and it'll snap into your hand. All of those things are unnatural actions that you do them and it's still part of the VR experience. But Beat Saber winds up playing only to the strengths. It completely hides all the weaknesses of it, because you are holding something in your hand. You keep a solid grip on it the whole time. It slices through things without ever bumping into things. You never get into the point where, I'm knocking on this table, but in VR, my hand just goes right through it. So you've got something that slices through. So it's never your brain telling you, oh, I should have hit something. You've got a lightsaber here. It's just you expect it to slice through everything. Audio and music turned out to be a really powerful aspect of virtual reality where you're blocking the world off and constructing the world around you. And being something that can run efficiently on even this relatively low-powered hardware and can have a valuable loop in a small amount of time, where a lot of modern games, you're supposed to sit down and play it for an hour just to get anywhere. Sometimes a new game takes an hour to get through the tutorial level. And that's not good for VR for a couple reasons. You do still have the comfort issues if you're moving around at all, but you've also got just discomfort from the headset, battery lifespan on the mobile versions. So having things that do break down into 3 and 4 minute windows of play, that turns out to be very valuable from a gameplay standpoint. So it winds up being kind of a perfect storm of all of these things that are really good. It doesn't have any of the comfort problems. You're not navigating around. You're standing still. All the stuff flies at you. It has placed audio strengths. It adds the whole fitness in VR. Nobody was thinking about that back at the beginning. And it turns out that is an excellent daily fitness thing to be doing. If you go play an hour of Beat Saber or Supernatural or something, that is legit solid exercise. And it's more fun than doing it just about any other way there.
So that's kind of the arcade stage of things. If I were to say, with my experience with VR, the thing that I think is powerful is maybe it's not here yet, but the degree to which it is immersive in the way that Quake is immersive. It takes you to another world. For me, because I'm a fan of role-playing games, the Elder Scrolls series, like Skyrim or even Daggerfall, it just takes you to another world. And when you're not in that world, you miss not being there. And then you kind of want to stay there forever because life is shitty.
Well, the whole point,
and you
my
just want to
pitch
go
for
to
VR
this place.
is that there was a time when we were kind of asked to come up with like, what's your view about VR? And my pitch was that it should be better inside the headset than outside. It's the world as you want it.
Yeah.
And everybody thought that was dystopian. And like, that's like, oh, you're just going to forget about the world outside. And I don't get that mindset where the idea that if you can make the world better inside the headset than outside, you've just improved the person's life that has a headset that can wear it. And there are plenty of things that we just can't do for everyone in the real world. Everybody can't have Richard Branson's private island, but everyone can have a private VR island, and it can have the things that they want on it. And there's a lot of these kind of rivalrous goods in the real world that VR can just be better at. We can do a lot of things like that can be very, very rich. So yeah, I think it's going to be a positive thing, this world where people want to go back into their headset, where it can be better than somebody that's living in a tiny apartment can have a palatial estate in virtual reality. They can have all their friends from all over the world come over and visit them without everybody getting on a plane and meeting in some place and dealing with all the other logistics hassles. There is real value in the
О VR они только сейчас, начали говорить. Он... Вроде бы он упоминал Half-Life, Алекс. Я не уверен. Вроде нет. Не, вроде Valve не
presence that you can get for remote meetings. It's all the little things that we need to sort out, but those are things that we have line of sight on. People, that have been in like a good VR meeting using workrooms where you can say, oh, that was better than a Zoom meeting. But of course, it's more of a hassle to get into it. Not everyone has the headset. Interoperability is worse. You cap out at a certain number. There's all these things that need to be fixed, but that's one of those things you can look at and say, we know there's value there. We just need to really grind hard to file off all the rough edges and make that possible.
So you do think we have line of sight, because there's a reason, like I do this podcast in person, for example. Doing it remotely, it's not the same. And if somebody were to ask me why it's not the same, I wouldn't be able to write down exactly why. But you're saying that it's possible, whatever the magic is for in-person interaction, that immersiveness of the experience, we are almost there.
Yes.
So it's
So
a
the
technical
idea of
problem.
I'm doing a VR interview with someone. I'm not saying it's here right now, but you can see glimmers of what it should be. And we largely know what would need to be fixed and improved to, like you say, there's a difference between a remote interview doing a podcast over Zoom or something and face to face. There's that sense of presence, that immediacy, the super low latency responsiveness, being able to see all the subtle things there, just occupying the same field of view. And all of those are things that we absolutely can do in VR. And that simple case of a small meeting with a couple people, that's the much easier case than everybody thinks the Ready Player One multiverse with 1,000 people going across a huge bridge to amazing places. That's harder in a lot of other technical ways. Not to say we can't also do that, but that's further away and has more challenges. But this small thing about being able to have a meeting with one or a few people and have it feel real, feel like you're there, like you have the same interactions and talking with them. You get subtle cues as we start getting eye and face tracking and some of the other things on high-end headsets. A lot of that is going to come over, and it doesn't have to be as good. This is an important thing that people miss, where there was a lot of people that, especially rich people, that would look at VR and say, it's like, oh, this just isn't that good. And I'd say it's like, well, you've already been courtside, backstage, and on pit row, and you've done all of these experiences because you get to do them in real life. But most people don't get to, and even if the experience is only half as good, if it's something that they never
Откуда у вас столько сил срать? Ну, это хороший вопрос на самом деле.
would have gotten to do before, it's still a very good thing. And as we can push that number up over time. It has a minimum viable value level when it does something that is valuable enough to people, as long as it's better inside the headset on any metric than it is outside, and people choose to go there, we're on the right path. And we have a value gradient that I'm just always hammering on. We can just follow this value gradient, just keep making things better rather than going for that one close your eyes, swing for the fences, kind of silver bullet approach.
Well, I wonder if there's a value gradient for in-person meetings, because if you get that right, I mean, that would change the world.
Yeah.
That it doesn't need to. I mean, you don't need Ready Player One. But I wonder if there's that value gradient you can follow along, because if there is and you follow it, then there'll be a certain phase shift at a certain point where people will shift from Zoom to this. I wonder what are the bottlenecks? Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it all about latency?
So I have big arguments internally about strategic things like that, where like the next headset that's coming out that we've made various announcements about is going to be a higher end headset, more expensive, more features. Lots of people want to make those trade-offs. Like the next.
Как же иммерсивно, подумал Кармак, сидя в VR. Кто-то насрал и не смысл за собой, заметил Ромеро.
Next headset that's coming out that we've made various announcements about is going to be a higher end headset, more expensive, more features. Lots of people want to make those trade-offs. We'll see what the market has to say about the exact trade-offs we've made here. But if you want to replace Zoom, you need to have something that everybody has. And
so you like cheaper.
I like cheaper because also lighter and cheaper wind up being a virtuous cycle there, where expensive and more features tends to also lead towards heavier, and it just kind of goes, it's like, let's add more features. The features are not, they have physical presence and weight and draw from batteries and all of those things. So I've always favored a lower end, cheaper, faster approach. That's why I was always behind the mobile side of VR rather than the higher end PC headsets. And I think that's proven out well. But ideally we have a whole range of things, but if you've only got one or two things, it's important that those two things cover the the scope that you think is most important. When we're in a world when it's like cell phones and there's 50 of them on the market covering every conceivable ecological niche you want, that's going to be great, but we're not going to be there for a while.
Не, у меня единственная проблема с VR, это, сейчас, это просто цена, я вот, типа, зачем? Веб-камера, сколько она сейчас стоит? Причем, мне кажется, неоправданно дорого стоит, возможно. Типа 5? 3? Некоторые не заморачиваются, не покупают там какой-нибудь Logitech, этот C920 берут что-то дешевле, и там, наверное, цена... сейчас я не знаю, что по ценам, сейчас все непонятно, но это не... Сколько сейчас VR какой-нибудь, который работает? Наверное, окей, если от Facebook, если убрать, то минимум 40, наверное, он сейчас стоит 50. 30 уже тысяч. Окей. Здорово, Алекс. То есть 30. Все равно это дохуя. Типа, если он будет стоить 5, все купят. 5 тысяч для VR это очень мало. Но я не знаю просто, как людям... не знаю. То есть он вроде как монитор, но он не воспринимается как монитор, что ли. Не знаю. Типа 30 тысяч на VR. Например, покупаешь какой-то монитор за 15-20 тысяч, и ты понимаешь, что там много всего ты можешь на нем отображать. А ты берешь VR за 30 тысяч, и ты понимаешь, что ты там можешь отображать, Beat Saber. Вот. И ты, получается, покупаешь Beat Saber за 30к, типа, нахуя тебе он нужен? То есть, да, можно, наверное, софтин и разные штуки сделать для VR, и как-то его применять. То есть он типа не оправдан в цене. То есть сначала дешманским тогда сделать и накопить там какого-то софта, который, после которого, наверное, можно дороже этот VR сделать или более технологичным. То есть начать чтобы спецификация у него была какая-то но доступна, а потом уже идти вверх. Не знаю. 30к, чтобы порнуху смотреть. И порнуха, как бы это дело такое, типа, у многих, наверное, я не знаю, без понятия, но, наверное, это можно 5 минут посмотреть, и типа все, и больше не надо. Подняли стоимость на $100. То есть мало того, что они типа стараются этот VR закрыть за стеной каких-то своих приложений, так они еще и баксы поднимают. Игру для VR... Да я не знаю. Не знаю, мне просто не нравится в нынешнем виде, как VR сейчас работает. Намного лучше, чем, наверное, было лет 5 назад, я не знаю. Или когда там со времен еще PlayStation VR какого-нибудь, да. То вообще в районе 25. Это уже более-менее приемлемо. Quest 2. Мне просто не нравится Facebook. Мне не нравится, что они делают. Мне не нравится, что они делают с VR в его типа программном плане, не в смысле. Техника у них прикольная, видимо, Кармак и многие, кто с ним работает, на это повлияли. Но то, что они делают в плане продвижения, то как, короче, просто какой-то, дикий понос, который, точнее, ощущение, что он будет вызывать у тебя дикий понос. Можно ко всему этому привыкнуть, но просто не хочется. Вторые сутки, 5 часов,
The bottlenecks. Is it the hardware or the software?
Yeah, so right now, you can get...
Продажи куста обгоняют до продажи всех шлемов. Вместе взят первый шлем, который берут не только энтузиасты. Прикольно, клево. Цена наверняка помогает этому.
Workrooms on Quest, and you can set up these things, and it's a pretty good experience. It's surprisingly good.
So I haven't tried it.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly...
Set up these things. You can get workrooms on Quest, and you can set up these things, and it's a pretty good experience. It's surprisingly good.
So I haven't tried it.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly good.
The voice latency...
Да, передвижение, то есть... Я до сих пор не знаю, типа, мне нравится, что постоянно на голове ты держишь какие-то батареи, с которыми всякое может быть. Да, я, тоже условно, конечно, у меня есть вейпы, тут тоже есть батарея, кто знает, как ее собирали. как бы есть небольшая паранойя в плане того, что у тебя на голове, если она беспроводная, какая-то штука, причем батареи, наверное, эти достаточно большие, как-то... У меня есть паранойя, связанная с этим. Ну, типа, ладно, эту паранойю можно с ней ее проработать, типа, забить и не бояться. Плюсом, опять же, этот размер. То есть хотелось бы просто очки, вот как берешь вот эти, то есть чтобы оно вот так работало. Ты их надел, все. Это не вот это, блядь, что, ну, непонятно. Понятное дело, что они идут к этому, уменьшают все, чтобы оно меньше-меньше было в плане технологии. Но пока что это вообще не работает. Ну и последнее, да, это в управлении. Типа вот этими геймпадами это просто неудобно управлять. Нужен чип в голове, чтобы можно было просто сигналы из мозга посылать. То есть им нужно уже как-то над этим начать работу скорее. Точнее, скорее, да, им нужно над передвижением, то, как ты управляешь без рук, а потом уже, наверное, все вместе это дело уменьшать. Хз. Да, я пробовал VR разные. Не, это кал. Ну, типа, это бессмысленно. Ну, то есть, может, не кал для какой-нибудь такой фигни, что, мол, для тренировок. Но не, типа... Типа, зачем? Это много сил просто тратит. Я могу на улице походить. Нужен чип. Мозг. Это не то. Чтобы я сигналы мог просто сам посылать, просто посмотрев на вещь. Вот. Или подумав. Я на новом или старом канале где-то играл в VR-чат. Я играл и в другие VR, там и в торговых центрах что-то пробовал. Beat Saber играл.
That then a lot better than a Zoom meeting. So you've got a better sense of immediacy there.
Да, то есть вот это, не знаю, вот этот VR, где ты типа ходишь, руками что-то двигаешь, это ни к чему. Фантазия сама по себе будет работать, тебе достаточно, то есть ты очки надеваешь, у тебя есть чип, и ты, в принципе, просто сидишь вот так вот и ходишь там, что-то делаешь. Но в то же время, да, непонятно как бы, как это по ощущениям будет. Тут мы руками, ногами двигаем, если на этой платформе ходить. Но... Наверное, вариант, где ты просто будешь ровно сидеть, будет эффективнее, чем если ты будешь где-то там что-то бегать. Ты просто больше будешь делать работы. Понятно, но только на пенсии попробовать удастся. Не думаю, если все будет хорошо, я думаю, что все будет хорошо, мы попробуем не на пенсии. Черное зеркало. Да, я смотрел черное зеркало, мне не очень нравится. Ну да, я знаю. Поэтому, да, просто это удобнее будет. Силой мысли делать, типа.
The expressions that you get from the current hardware with just kind of your controllers in your head is pretty realistic feeling. And you got a pretty good sense of being there with someone with
Are
it.
these like avatars of people?
Yeah.
Like, do you get to see their body?
Yeah.
And they're sitting around a table.
Yeah.
And it feels better than Zoom.
Better than you'd expect for that. It is definitely, yeah, I'd say it's quite a bit better than Zoom when everything's working right. But there's still all the rough edges of the reason Zoom became so successful is because they just nailed the.
Типа они продвигают это в стиле что-то как... Ну, короче, тут VR-чат не упоминается. ЭГ, который считывает волны, если программируешь штуку, считывающую хотя бы в 2 кода, можно сделать тоже, по сути, как VR. Ну да, я как понимаю, там этот чип так и работает, который вставляется в мозг, то, что там Илон Маск делает, и не только. По сути, да, просто волны интерпретирует, ты как бы тренируешься, наверное, или чип тренируется интерпретацией хз, кто должен кому-то тренироваться. Ну да, и потом можешь управлять. Перчатки самый прикольный вид контроллера, как по мне. Да, до этого тоже про перчатки писали. То есть вы предполагаете, что перчатки поинтереснее просто-напросто будут? Power Glove. Ну да, если все пальцы можно будет использовать. Непонятно, как программировать, конечно, взаимодействие с вещами, но да, наверное.
Usability of everything. It's high quality with a absolutely first-rate experience. And we are not there yet with any of the VR stuff. I'm trying to push hard to get I keep talking about it's like it needs to just be one click to make everything happen. And we're getting there in our home environment, not the whole Workrooms application, but the main home where you can now kind of go over and click an invite, and it still winds up taking 5 times longer than it should. But we're getting close to that where you click there, they click on their button, and then they're sitting there in this good presence with you. But latencies need to get a lot better. User interface needs to get a lot better. Ubiquity of the headsets needs to get better. We need to have 100 million of them out there just so that everybody knows somebody that uses this all the time.
Well, I think it's a virtuous cycle because I do think the interface is the thing that makes or breaks this kind of revolution. It's so interesting how, like, you said one click, but it's also like how you achieve that one click. I don't know. What is, can I ask a dark question? Maybe let's keep it outside of Meta. But this is about Meta, but also Google and big company. Are they able to do this kind of thing? It seems like, let me put on my cranky old man hat, is they seem to not do a good job of creating these user-friendly interfaces as they get bigger and bigger as a company. Like Google has created some of the greatest interfaces ever early on, and it's, I mean, creating Gmail, just so many brilliant interfaces, and it just seems to be getting crappier and crappier at that. Same with Meta, same with Microsoft. It's just, it seems to get worse and worse at that. I don't know what it is. Because you've become more conservative, careful, risk averse. Is that why? Can you speak to that?
So it's been really eye-opening to me working inside a tech titan where
Tesla Suit. Всякие это одежды. Не, спасибо большое. Ну, я открою, я гляну, что это.
Здравствуйте, тебе пользование электростимулятор.
Ну, вот как с костюмом тоже кидали, да, показывали. Слушай, если делать full VR, то внешнее раздражение будет восприниматься мозгом. Типа как как наушники некоторые делают, что изолируют звук внешне.
Careful.
Можно наушники просто надеть.
Risk averse. Is that...
Ну, Кармак уже говорил про то, что Beat Saber, когда играешь, там музыка играет, и она, по сути, тебя разделяет от внешнего мира, ты как раз-таки полностью погружен, находишься в этой игре.
Why? Can you speak to that?
So it's been really eye-opening to me working inside a tech titan where I had my small companies, and then we're acquired by a mid-sized game publisher, and then Oculus getting acquired by Meta, and Meta has grown by a factor of many just in the 8 years since the acquisition. So I did not have experience with this, and it was interesting because I remember, like, previously my benchmark for kind of use of resources was some of the government programs I interacted with on the aerospace side. And I remember thinking there was an Air Force program and they spent $50 million and they didn't launch anything. They didn't even build anything. It was just kind of like they made a bunch of papers and had some parts in a warehouse and nothing came of it. It's like $50 million. And I've had to radically recalibrate my sense of like how much money can be spent with
without a product at the end
resources. Where on the plus side, VR has turned out we've built pretty much exactly what we just passed the 10-year mark then from my first demo of the Rift. And if I could have said what I wanted to have, it would have been a standalone inside-out tracked 4K resolution headset that could still plug into a PC for high-end rendering. And that's exactly what we've got on Quest 2 right now.
First of all, let's pause on that with me being cranky and everything. It's what Meta achieved with Oculus and so on is incredible. I mean, when I thought about the future of VR, this is what I imagined in terms of hardware, I would say. And maybe in terms of the experience as well, but it's still not there somehow.
On the one hand, we did kind of achieve it and win, and we've sold, we're a success right now. But the amount of resources that have gone into it, it winds up getting cluttered up in accounting, where Mark did announce that they spent $10 billion a year, like on Reality Labs. Now, Reality Labs covers a lot. VR was not the large part of it. It also had Portal and Spark, covers a lot. It was VR. A year, like on Reality Labs. Now, Reality Labs covers a lot. It was VR was not the large part of it. It also had Portal and Spark and the big AR research efforts. And it's been expanding out to include AI and other things there, where there's a lot going on there. Portal and Spark and the big AR research efforts. And it's been expanding out to include AI and other things there, where there's a lot going on there. But $10 billion was just a number that I had trouble processing. I feel sick to my stomach thinking about that much money being spent. But that's how they demonstrate commitment to this, where it's not more so than Google goes and cancels all of these projects, different things like that, while Meta is really sticking with the funding of VR, and AR is still further out with it. So there's something to be said for that. It's not just going to vanish. The work's going in. I just wish it could be, all those resources could be applied more effectively, because I see all these cases. I point out these examples of how a third party that we're kind of competing with in various ways. There's a number of these examples, and they do work with a tenth of the people that we do internally. And a lot of it comes from, there's the small company can just go do it, while in a big company, you do have to worry about, is there some SDK internally that you should be using because another team's making it? You have to have your cross-functional.
Вы сказали, что он просто лежит пылиться, потому что играть в VR летом — это просто невыносимо даже с коня.
Group meetups for different things. You do have more concerns about privacy or diversity and equity and safety of different things, parental issues, and things that a small startup company can just kind of, cowboy off and do something interesting. And there's a lot more that is a problem that you have to pay attention to in the big companies, but I'm not willing to believe that we are within even a factor of 2 or 4 of what the efficiency could be. I am constantly kind of crying out for, it's like, we can do better than this.
Yeah, and you wonder what the mechanisms to unlock that efficiency are. I don't, there is some sense in a large company that, like, an individual engineer might not believe that they can change the world. Maybe you delegate a little bit of the responsibility to be the one who changes the world in a big company, I think. But the reality is, like, the world will get changed by a single engineer anyway. So whether inside Google or inside a startup, it doesn't matter. It's just like Google and Meta needs to help those engineers believe. They're the ones that are going to decrease that latency. It'll take those engineers believe. They're the ones that are going to decrease that latency. It'll take one John Carmack, like the 20-year-old Carmack that's inside Meta right now, to change everything.
And I try to point that out and push people. It's like, try to go ahead. And when you see because you get the silo mentality where you're like, okay, I know something's not right over there, but I'm staying in my lane here. And there's a couple people that I can think about that are willing to just like hop all over the place. And man, I treasure them. The people that are just they're fearless. They will go over and they will go rebuild the kernel and change this distribution and go in and hack the firmware over here to get something done right. And that is relatively rare. There's thousands of developers, and you've got a small handful that are willing to operate at that level. And, and it's potentially risky for them. The politics are real in a lot of that. And I'm in the, very much the privileged position of I'm more or less untouchable there, where I've been dinged like twice for, it's like, you said something insensitive in that post, and you should probably not say that. But for the most part, yes, I get away with every week I'm posting something, pretty loud and opinionated internally. And I think that's useful for the company. But it's rare to have a position like that. And I can't necessarily offer advice for how someone can do that.
Well, you could offer advice to a company in general to give a little bit of freedom for the young, like the wildest ideas come from the young minds. And so you need to give the young minds freedom to think big and wild and crazy. And for that, they have to be opinionated. They have to be, they have to think crazy ideas and thoughts and pursue them with a full passion without being slowed down by bureaucracy or managers and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, startups really empower that, but big companies could too. And that's a design challenge for big companies to see how can you enable that? How can you empower
because the
that?
big company, there are so many resources there,
Right.
and they do, amazing things do get accomplished, but there's so much more that could come out of that. And I'm always hopeful. I'm an optimist in almost everything. I think things can get better. I think that they can improve things, that you go through a path and you're learning kind of what does and doesn't work. And I'm not ready to be fatalistic about the outcome of any of that.
Me neither. I know too many good people inside of those large companies that are incredible. You have a friendship with Elon Musk. Often when I talk to him, he'll bring up how incredible of an engineer and just a big picture thinker you are. He has a huge amount of respect for you. I've never been a fly in the wall between the discussion between the two of you. I just wonder, is there something you guys debate, argue about, discuss? Is there some interesting problems that the two of you think about? You come from different worlds. Maybe there's some intersection in aerospace. Maybe there's some intersection in your new efforts in artificial intelligence in terms of thinking. Is there something interesting you could say about sort of the debates the two of you have?
So I think in some ways we do have a kind of similar background where we're almost exactly the same age, and we had kind of similar programming backgrounds on the personal computers, and even some of the books that we would read and things that would kind of turn us into the people that we are today. And I think there is a degree of sensibility similarities where, we kind of call bullshit on the same things and kind of see the same opportunities in different technology. And there's that sense of, I always talk about the speed of light solutions for things, and he's thinking about kind of minimum manufacturing and engineering and operational standpoints for things. And so, I first...
Так получается, им просто нужно работать вместе. Кармак системы создает, Илон Маск просто занимается бизнесом и как раз-таки системами, такими заводами, я не знаю, как это объяснить в таком случае. Чё он, блядь, вообще в Фейсбуке делает?
Met Elon right at the start of the aerospace era, where I wasn't familiar with, I was still in my game dev bubble. I really wasn't familiar with all the startups that were going and being successful and what went on with PayPal and all of his different companies. But, I met him as I was starting to do Armadillo Aerospace, and, he came down with kind of his right-hand propulsion guy, and we talked about rockets.
Я не знаю, как объяснить. То есть Маск, он как менеджер своего рода, а Кармак типа инженеры. Они могли бы вот создавать команды и работать друг с другом. Скорее всего, у него было бы хорошее понимание. И очень эффективно получалось бы распределять ресурсы и делать какие-то вещи. Ну, кто знает.
What can we do with this? And it was kind of specific things about like how are our flight computers set up? What are different propellant options? What can happen with different ways of putting things together? And then in some ways, he was certainly the biggest player in the sort of alt space community that was going on in the early 2000s. He was the most well-funded, although, his funding in the larger scheme of things compared to a NASA or something like that was really tiny. It was a lot more than I had at the time. But it was interesting. I had a point years later when I realized, okay, my financial resources at this point are basically what Elon's was when he went all in on SpaceX and Tesla. And I think in many corners he does not get the respect that he should about being a wealthy person that could just retire. And he went all in, where he was really going to, he could have gone bust. And there's plenty of people. You look at the sad athletes or entertainers that had all the money in the world and blew it. He could have been the business case example of that. But the things that he was doing, space exploration, electrification of transportation, solar city type things, these are big world level things. And I have a great deal of admiration that he was willing to throw himself so completely into that, because in contrast with myself, I was doing Armadillo Aerospace with this tightly bounded, it was John's crazy money at the time that had a finite limit on it. It was never going to impact me or my family if it completely failed. And I was still hedging my bets working at id Software at the time when he had been really all in there. And I have a huge amount of respect for that. And people do not, the other thing I get irritated with is people that say, it's like, oh, Elon's just a business guy. He just got, he was gifted the money and he's just kind of investing in all of this, when he was really deeply involved in a lot of the decisions. Not all of them were perfect, but he cared very much about engine material selection, propellant selection, and for years he'd be kind of telling me, it's like, get off that hydrogen peroxide stuff. It's like, liquid oxygen is the only proper oxidizer for this. And and like the times that I've gone through the factories with him, we're talking very detailed things about like how this weld is made, how this subassembly goes together, what are like startup shutdown behaviors of the different things. So he is, really in there at a very detailed level. And I think that he is the best modern example now of someone that can effectively micromanage some decisions on things on both Tesla, and SpaceX to some degree, where he cares enough about it. I worry a lot that he's stretched too thin, that you get Boring Company and Neuralink and Twitter and all the other possible things there, where I know I've got limits on how much I can pay attention to, that I have to kind of box off different amounts of time. And I look back at my aerospace side of things, it's like I did not go all in on that. I did not commit myself at a level that it would have taken to be successful there. And and it's kind of a weird thing, just like having a discussion with him. He's the richest man in the world right now, but
Right.
he operates on a level that is still very much in my wheelhouse on a technical side of things. So
That doing that systems level type of thinking where you
Yeah.
can go to the low level details and go up high to the big picture. Do you think in aerospace arena in the next 5-10 years, do you think we're going to put a human on Mars? Like, what do you think is the interesting
no, I do. In fact,
point?
I made a bet with someone,
Yes.
with a group of people, kind of this, about whether boots on Mars by 2030. And this was kind of a fun story, because I was at an Intel sponsored event and we had a bunch of just world-class brilliant people. And we were talking about computing stuff, but the after dinner conversation was like, what are some other things? How are they going to go in the future? And one of the ones tossed up on the whiteboard was like boots on Mars by 2030. And most of the people in the room thought, yes, they thought that like SpaceX is kicking ass. We've got all this possible stuff. Seems likely that it's going to go that way. And I said, no, I think less than 50% chance that it's going to make it there. And people, were kind of like, oh, why the pessimism or whatever. And of course, I'm an optimist at almost everything. But for me to be the one kind of outlier saying, no, I don't think so, then I started saying some of the things. I said, well, let's be concrete about it. Let's bet $10,000 that it's not going to happen. And this was really a startling thing to see, that again, room full of brilliant people. But as soon as like money came on the line and they were like, do I want to put $10,000? And I was not the richest person in the room. There were people much better off than I was. There's a spectrum, but as soon as they started thinking, it's like, oh, I could lose money by keeping my position right now. And all these engineers, they engaged their brain. They started thinking, it's like, okay, launch windows, launch delays, like how many times would it take to get this right? What historical precedents do we have? And then it mostly came down to, it's like, well, what about in transit by 20?
Спасибо большое.
Приветствую, Юзя. Я смотрю тебя давно еще с бородатых времен. Можно сказать, рос на твоем творчестве. И где-то раз в год пересматриваю видосики. Хочу сказать спасибо за все.
Спасибо огромное. Спасибо, очень приятно. Рад стараться. Спасибо, Епако. Спасибо большое.
2030, and then it mostly came down to, it's like, well, what about in transit by 2030? And then what about different things, or would you go for 2032? But one of the people did go ahead and was optimistic enough to make a bet with me. So I have a $10,000 bet that by 2030, I think it's going to happen shortly thereafter. I think there will probably be infrastructure on Mars by 2030, but I don't think that we'll have humans on Mars on 2030. I think it's possible, but I think it's less than a 50% chance, so I felt safe making that bet.
Well, I think you had an interesting point. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's a dark one. That's that should perhaps help people appreciate Elon Musk, which is, in this particular effort, Elon is critical to the success. SpaceX seems to be critical to the humans on Mars by 2030 or thereabouts. So if something happens to Elon, then all of this collapses.
Right. And this is in contrast to the other $10,000 bet I made kind of recently, and that was self-driving cars at like a level 5 running around cities. And people have kind of nitpicked that we probably don't mean exactly level 5, but the guy I'm having the bet with we know what we mean about this.
Jeff Atwood.
Yeah, coding horror and Stack
horror.
Overflow and all.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just, he doesn't think that people are going to be riding around in robo-taxis in 2030 in major cities, just like you take an Uber now. And I think it will.
You think it will.
And the difference is everybody looks at this, it's like, oh, but Tesla's been wrong for years. They've been promising it for years and it's not here yet. And the reason this is different than the bet with Mars is Mars really is more than is comfortable a bet on Elon Musk. That is his thing, and he is really going to move heaven and earth to try to make that happen.
And perhaps not even SpaceX.
Yeah.
Perhaps just Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if Elon went away and SpaceX went public and got a board of directors, there are more profitable things they could be doing than focusing on human presence on Mars. So this really is a sort of personal thing there. And in contrast with that, self-driving cars have a dozen credible companies working really hard. And while, yes, it's going slower than most people thought it would, betting against that is a bet against almost the entire world in terms of all of these companies that have all of these incentives. It's not just, one guy's passion project. And I do think that it is solvable, although I recognize it's not 100% chance because it's possible the long tail of self-driving problems winds up being an AGI complete problem. I think there's plenty of value to mine out of it with narrow AI, and I think that it's going to happen probably more so than people expect. But it's that whole sigmoid curve where you overestimate the near-term progress and you underestimate the long-term progress. And I think self-driving is going to be like that. And I think 2030 is still a pretty good bet.
Yeah, unfortunately, self-driving is a problem that is safety critical, meaning that if you don't do it well, people get hurt.
But the other side of that is people are terrible drivers. So it is not going to be, that's probably going to be the argument that gets it through, is like, we can save 10,000 lives a year by taking imperfect self-driving cars and letting them take over a lot of driving responsibilities. It's 30,000 people a year die in auto accidents right now in America. And a lot of those are preventable. And the problem is you'll have people that every time a Tesla crashes into something, you've got a bunch of people that literally have vested interest shorting Tesla to come out and make it the worst thing in the world. And people will be fighting against that. But optimist in me again, I think that we will have systems that are statistically safer than human drivers. And we will be saving thousands and thousands of lives every year when we can hand over more of those responsibilities to it.
I do still think, as a person who studied this problem very deeply from a human side as well, it's still an open problem how good/bad humans are at driving. It's a kind of funny thing we say about each other. Oh, humans suck at driving. Everybody except you, of course. Like, we think we're good at driving. But after really studying it, I think you start to notice, because I've watched hundreds of hours of humans driving with the projects of this kind of thing. You've noticed that even with the distraction, even with everything else, humans are able to do some incredible things with the attention. Even when you're just looking at the smartphone, just to get cues from the environment, to make last seconds decisions, to use instinctual type of decisions that actually save your ass time and time and time again, and are able to do that with so much uncertainty around you in such tricky dynamic environments. I don't know. I don't know exactly how hard is it to beat that kind of skill of common sense reasoning.
So this is one of those interesting things that there have been a lot of studies about how experts in their field usually underestimate the progress that's going to happen because an expert thinks about all the problems they deal with and they're like, damn, I'm going to have a hard time solving all of this. And they filter out the fact that they are one expert in a field of thousands. And, you think about, I can't do all of that. And you sometimes forget about the scope of the ecosystem that you're embedded in. And if you think back 8 years, very specifically, the state of AI and machine learning, where was that we had just gotten ResNets probably at that point. And you look at all the amazing magical things that have happened in 8 years. And they do kind of seem to be happening a little faster in recent years also. And you project that 8 more years into the future, where, again, I think there's a 50% chance we're going to have signs of life of AGI, which we can put through driver's ed if we need to actually build self-driving cars. And I think that the narrow systems are going to have real value demonstrated well before then.
So signs of life in AGI, you've mentioned that. Okay, first of all, you're one of the most brilliant people on this earth. You could be solving a number of different problems, as you've mentioned. Your mind was attracted to nuclear energy. Obviously, virtual reality with the metaverse is something you could have a tremendous impact on.
So I do want to say a quick thing about nuclear energy, where this is something that this so precisely feels like aerospace before SpaceX, where from everything that I know about all of these, the physics of this stuff hasn't changed, and the reasons why things are expensive now are not fundamental. Somebody should be going into really hard Elon Musk style at fission, economical fission, not fusion, where the fusion is the kind of the darling of people that want to go and do nuclear because it doesn't have the taint that fission has in a lot of people's minds. But it's an almost absurdly complex thing where nuclear fusion is, you look at the tokamaks or any of the things that people are building, and it's doing all of this infrastructure just at the end of the day to make something hot that you can then turn into energy through a conventional power plant. And all of that work, which we think we've got line of sight on, but even if it comes out, then you have to do all of that immensely complex, expensive stuff just to make something hot, where nuclear fission is basically you put these two rocks together and they get hot all by themselves. That is just that much simpler. It's just orders of magnitude simpler. And the actual rocks, the refined uranium, is not very expensive. It's a couple % of the cost of electricity. That's why I made that point where you could have something which was 5 times less efficient than current systems. And if the rest of the plant was a whole bunch cheaper, you could still be super, super valuable.
So how much of the pie do you think could be solved by nuclear energy by fission? So how much could it become the primary source of energy on Earth?
It could be most of it. Like the reserves of uranium as it stands now could not power the whole Earth. But you get into breeder reactors and thorium and things like that you do for conventional fission. There is enough for everything. Now, I mean, solar photovoltaic has been amazing. One of my current projects is working on an off-grid system, and it's been fun just kind of, again, putting my hands on all the, stripping the wires and wiring things together and doing all of that. And just having followed that a little bit from the outside over the last couple decades, there's been semiconductor-like magical progress in what's going on there. So I'm all for all of that, but it doesn't solve everything, and nuclear really still does seem like the smart money bet for what you should be getting for baseband on a lot of things. And solar may be cheaper for, peaking over air conditioning loads during the summer and things that you can push around in different ways. But it's one of those things it's just strange how we've had the technology sitting there, but these non-technical reasons on the social optics of it has been this major forcing function for something that really should be at the cornerstone of all of the world's concerns with energy. It's interesting how the non-technical factors have really dominated something that is so fundamental to kind of the existence of the human race as we know it today.
And much of the troubles of the world, including wars in different parts of the world, like Ukraine, is energy-based. And it's just sitting right there to be solved. That said, to me personally, I think it's clear that if AGI were to be achieved, that would change the course of human history.
So AGI-wise, I was making this decision about what do I want to focus on after VR. And I'm still working on VR regularly. I spend a day a week kind of consulting with Meta, and Boz styles me the consulting CTO. It's kind of like the Sherlock Holmes that comes in and consults on some of the specific tough issues. And I'm still pretty passionate about all of that, but I have been figuring out how to compartmentalize and force that into a smaller box to work on some other things. And I did come down to this decision between working on economical nuclear fission or artificial general intelligence. And the fission side of things, I've got a bunch of interesting things going that way, but that would be a fairly big project thing to do. I don't think it needs to be as big as people expect. I do think something original SpaceX sized, you build it, power your building off of it, and then the government, I think, will come around to what you need to. Everybody loves an existence proof. I think it's possible. Somebody should be doing this, but it's going to involve some politics. It's going to involve decent sized teams and a bunch of this cross-functional stuff that I don't love. While the artificial general intelligence side of things, it seems to me like this is the highest leverage moment for potentially a single individual, potentially in the history of the world, where the things that we know about the brain, about what we can do with artificial intelligence, nobody can say absolutely on any of these things, but I am not a madman for saying that it is likely that the code for artificial general intelligence is going to be tens of thousands of lines of code, not millions of lines of code. This is code that conceivably one individual could write, unlike writing a new web browser or operating system. And based on the progress that machine learning has made in the recent decade, it's likely that the important things that we don't know are relatively simple. There's probably a handful of things, and my bet is that I think there's less than 6 key insights that need to be made. Each one of them can probably be written on the back of an envelope. We don't know what they are, but when they're put together in concert with GPUs at scale and the data that we all have access to, that we can make something that behaves like a human being or like a living creature, and that can then be educated in whatever ways that we need to get to the point where we can have universal remote workers, where anything that somebody does mediated by a computer and doesn't require physical interaction, that an AGI will be able to do. We can already simulate the equivalent of the Zoom meetings with avatars and synthetic deep fakes and whatnot. We can definitely do that. We have superhuman capabilities on any narrow thing that we can formalize and make a loss function for, but there's things we don't know how to do now. But I don't think they are unapproachably hard. Now, that's incredibly hubristic to say that...
Когда создадут AGI, Ну, если Facebook Кармака не будет отвлекать, то, наверное... Ну, ощущение, что это где-то через 7 лет будет, ну, к 30-му году, наверное. Ну, я не совсем пока понимаю, что имеется в виду под AGI, поэтому... Но звучит очень интересно. Прикольно то, что Карма говорит, что это просто какие-то простые вещи, которые мы не понимаем, и достаточно просто как-то понять это, написать, и типа все будет работать просто-напросто. Всё. То есть там не нужно будет огромное количество команд для сборки чего-то. Наверное, у меня такое же ощущение, да, если нужно написать искусственный интеллект, типа ты его просто возьмешь и напишешь, и все.
It's like, but I think that what I said a couple years ago is a 50% chance that somewhere there will be signs of life of AGI in 2030. And I've probably increased that slightly. I may be at 55, 60% now, because I do think there's a little sense of acceleration there.
So I wonder and by the way, you also written that I bet with hindsight we will find that clear antecedents of all the critical remaining steps for AGI are already buried somewhere in the vast literature of today. So the ideas are already there.
I think that's likely the case. One of the things that appeals to so many people, including me, about the promise of AGI is we know that we're only drinking from a straw from the fire hose of all the information out there. I mean, you look at just in a very narrowly bounded field like machine learning, like you can't read all the papers that come out all the time. You can't go back and read all the clever things that people did in the 90s or earlier that people have forgotten about because they didn't pan out at the time when they were trying to do them with 12 neurons. So that this idea that, yeah, I think there are gems buried in some of the older literature that was not the path taken by everything. And you can see a kind of herd mentality on the things that happen right now. It's almost funny to see, it's like, oh, Google does something and OpenAI does something, Meta does something. And, you know, they're the same people that all talk to each other and they're all one-upping each other and they're all capable of implementing each other's work given a month or two after somebody has an announcement of that. But there's a whole world of possible approaches to machine learning. And I think that we probably will, in hindsight, go back and see it's like, yeah, that was kind of clearly predicted by this early paper here. And this turns out that if you do this and this and take this result from animal training and this thing from neuroscience over here and put it together and set up this curriculum for them to learn in, that's kind of what it took. You don't have too many people now that are still saying it's not possible or it's going to take hundreds of years. And 10 years ago, you would get a collection of experts and you would have a decent chunk on the margin that either say not possible or a couple hundred years, might be centuries. And the median estimate would be like 50, 70 years. And it's been coming down. And I know with me saying 8 years for something, that still puts me on the optimistic side, but it's not crazy out in the fringes. And just being able to look at that at a meta level about the trend of the trend of the predictions going down there, the idea that something could be happening relatively soon. Now, I do not believe in fast takeoffs. That's one of the safety issues that people say. It's like, oh, it's going to go boom, and the AI is going to take over the world. There's a lot of reasons I don't think that's a credible position. And I think that we will go from a point where we start seeing things that credibly look like animals' behaviors and have a human voice box wired into them. It's like I tried to get Elon to say it's like your pig at Neuralink, give it a human voice box and let it start learning human words. I think that I think animal intelligence is closer to human intelligence than a lot of people like to think. And I think that culture and modalities of I/O make the gulf seem a lot bigger than it actually is. There's just that smooth spectrum of how the brain developed and cortexes and scaling of different things going on there.
Cultural modalities of I/O. Yes, language is the sort of lost in translation conceals a lot of intelligence. And so when you think about signs of life for AGI, you're thinking about human interpretable signs.
So the example I give, if we get to the point where you've got a learning disabled toddler, some kind of real special needs child that can still interact with their favorite TV show and video game and can be trained and learn in some appreciably human-like way, at that point, you can deploy an army of engineers, cognitive scientists, developmental education people, and you've got so many advantages there, unlike real education, where you can do rollbacks and A/B testing, and you can find a golden path through a curriculum of different things. If you get to that point, learning disabled toddler, I think that it's going to be a done deal.
But do you think we'll know it when we see it? So there's been a lot of really interesting general learning progress from DeepMind, OpenAI a little bit too. I tend to believe that Tesla Autopilot deserves a lot more credit than it's getting for making progress on the general, on the doing the multitask learning thing and increasing the number of tasks and automating that process of learning from the edge, discovering the edge cases and learning from the edge cases. It's really approaching from a different angle the general learning problem of AGI. But the more clear approach comes from DeepMind, where you have these kind of game situations and you build systems there. But I don't know. People seem to be quite...
Yeah, there will always be people that just won't believe it, and I fundamentally don't care. I mean, I don't care if they don't believe it. When it starts doing people's jobs, and I don't care about the philosophical zombie argument at all.
Absolutely. But do you think you will notice that something special has happened here? Because to me, I've been noticing a lot of special things. I think a lot of credit should go to DeepMind for Alpha Zero. That was truly special. Those self-play mechanisms solve problems that used to be thought unsolvable, like the game of Go.
Чего-то из работы берут? Не совсем. Люди будут просто больше заниматься тем, что им интересно. Вместо того, чтобы они приняли какие-то определенные решения или за них приняли решение, и они решили сделать так, потому что им так сказали, а они не приняли, может быть, свое решение, неважно. Они попали в ситуацию, где им не нравится что-то делать, но им это приходится делать, потому что жить хочется, вот это все. И искусственный интеллект как бы поможет, по сути, сократить время на работу над вещами, которые, просто очень скучные. Например, для всех вообще. То есть прям максимально скучные, никто не хочет это делать. То есть робот вполне сможет этим заняться. Или искусственный интеллект заняться. Ему пофиг, наверное, будет. Почему бы нет. Вот. И люди просто больше будут... наверное, люди просто начнут, скажут такое: окей, мне все это не нравится, начнут драться там друг с другом, да, но там, подерутся, потом успокоятся, как обычно было. Приходил там, он выглядел хуже, стал меньше в мете работать, хорошо. Нет, реально? Да, он же сказал, что он один день всего лишь там работает, так что да. Может быть, он оттуда не уходит, потому что он, не то что не может уйти, но он, мягко оттуда дропается, чтобы это не резко было, что он, потихоньку оттуда удаляется, чтобы потом сказать такое. Чтобы уже все начали чуть-чуть потихоньку о нем забывать, а там он своими вещами каким-то занимался. Наверное, он более тактично это делает, чем, сказать, все, всем пока. Что он, может быть, там кто-то разозлится, не знаю, начнет мстить, или какая-то такая хрень, бог его знает. От системы образования зависеть будет? Да, наверное. Да, в зависимости от опыта, как люди думают, что они будут воспринимать, что, наконец-таки придут и заберут мою работу, которая мне не нравится, я займусь какими-то другими вещами, но в реальном мире так получается, что ты просто остаешься без работы и все. Но... Возможно, просто людей нужно тренировать к тому, чтобы они тянулись к вещам, которые им нравятся, и они были бы максимально полезны в этих вещах. Просто этому вообще не учат. Вообще об этом не говорят. Не уверен, что где-то об этом говорят. Об этом говорят там, может, философы какие-нибудь, да, или там коучи или там вот, или так, как я, стример такой, сидит стример, ему донатит такой, о, занимайтесь тем, что вам нравится и все такое. Но, да, как бы это просто людям не говорят. Ну, я просто здесь, потому что просто так захотел, потому что и я не буду стримить, типа, все время, то есть я не планирую, что стриминг это будет основной заработок, нет, это просто переходный этап, где я буду делать игры, то есть этим заниматься, а там уже дальше посмотрим. Например, пить пиво. Да, наверное, кто-то просто хочет пить пиво, типа, почему бы нет? Не знаю. Мне кажется, ну, навряд ли будет так, как вот в антиутопиях пишут, да, что, о, люди будут только потреблять, и больше ничего, им больше ничего не нужно. Да это скучно станет всем. Ну, типа, ну, человеку, в смысле, становится в определенный момент скучно. Он не будет доводить себя до какого-то такого состояния, где он, ну, там, тогда человек себя просто до болезни какой доведет, а никто не хочет болеть, и поэтому, скорее всего, в один момент, когда он там будет слишком много отдыхать, и он так, ему придет какая-то идея, ой, мне так надоело, я займусь какой-нибудь такой штукой, которой я хотел бы заняться, допустим. То есть я не думаю, тут я как бы оптимистичен в плане, что не будет антиутопии, не будет какой-то утопии, все будет вполне это в балансе. Может быть, где-то пошатнется в одну сторону, в другую сторону, если это какие-то одни вещи, если это какие-то новые вещи будут появляться в нашей жизни, но да, потом все забалансится просто. Которые живут только на дотациях, и ничего, их станет только больше. Ну да, ну я не знаю, то есть типа, не знаю, разве это плохо? То есть у кого-то будут идеи чем-то заняться, у кого-то не будет идеи заняться. Если да, если будет какая-то поддержка, что, окей, я могу себе позволить ничем не заниматься и типа просто, не знаю, сидеть играть, чилить. Да, можешь. Ну все, супер, отлично. Просто нужно такие условия создать. Но да, но в реальном мире я не знаю, как это все сделать, непонятно. Кто-то, может быть, просто скажет, блин, все, надоело резня, короче, я не знаю, как это в истории людей бывает, хз. Ну, посмотрим. Которые, это содержание таких браганов, это плохо. Ну, мне кажется, здесь психологическая проблема, возможно, даже не образование, типа, что, мол, мы учимся, чтобы, типа, они были образованы, но вопрос в том, как учить людей, не обязательно это может быть какая-то принятая программа, но люди, если у них все плохо или они делают какие-то плохие вещи, мне кажется, это в основном из-за того, что они просто обижены на что-то, и все. И они уже даже не знают об этом, что они на что-то обижены. И просто вот искусственный интеллект понизит вот это количество, вот этот, я не знаю, вирус обиды, скажем так, который очень древний, какая-то очень древняя энергия, подвязана на гормонах или на чем-то, ну, эти эмоции. Но определенно с приходом искусственного интеллекта вот этой обиды будет меньше, мне кажется. Ну, то есть ее не станет больше. Может быть, с приходом оно типа увеличится, но потом сразу упадет. Сконцентрироваться на образовании. Тоже верно, да. Скорее всего, если будет ситуация, когда, я в безвыходной ситуации, что мне сделать? Мне ничего не остается, кроме как понять, чего я хочу, что нужно делать, а чтобы это сделать, мне нужно, типа, чему-то выучиться, и, типа, я буду учиться тогда в таком случае. Да. Сложно. Было бы так все просто. Ну, кто-то, наверное, просто такой, а зачем это, собственно, делать, если я, например, могу что-то украсть, допустим, да, или что-то плохое другому сделать, но как бы мне будет хорошо. Вечная проблема. А сколько осталось? О, час остался, класс. Кайф. Окей.
Also, I mean, protein folding, starting to get into that space where learning is doing. At first, there's not. It wasn't end-to-end learning, and now it's end-to-end learning of a very difficult, previously thought unsolvable problem of protein folding. And so, yeah, where do you think would be a really magical moment for you?
There have been incredible things happening in recent years. Like you say, all of the things from DeepMind and OpenAI that have been huge showpiece things. But when you really get down to it and you read the papers and you look at the way the models are going, it's still like a feed forward. You push something in, something comes out on the end. I mean, maybe there's diffusion models or Monte Carlo tree rollouts and different things going on, but it's not a being. It's not close to a being.
Как-нибудь скорее связан с сегодняшними нейросетками. А он как раз про это говорит. Да, нейросетки сейчас воспринимаются просто как функция определенная. Ты типа даешь этот X и что-то получаешь. Да, наверное, если подумать о людях, то как они работают, там, животным вообще жизнь, неважно. Типа, скажем так, является ли человек или сознание то, что, короче, это действие, это функция? Или как это описать? Ощущение, что, по крайней мере, человек, он создает функции, а не, типа, скармливает, что ли, этой функции. Не знаю. Да, сложно, я не думал об этом. Лаборатория у Майков. Да, ну да, нейросетки, вот то, что сейчас вот недавно вышло, где можно концепт-арты делать, если написать словами, она тебе выдаст. Но это все равно в определенном каком-то стиле делается, как я понял, или не обязательно? Вроде нет. Может быть, просто у меня такие картинки попадались. Не знаю, я, короче, смотрел на все эти картинки, я такой, блин, прикольно, но... Это не картинки в стиле, когда тебя срисовывают там в туристических местах на улице, просто челы, в принципе, какому-то алгоритму научились. Ну, то есть, оно скорее вот похоже на что-то вот такое, а не на что-то похоже, что, окей, этот искусственный интеллект, он заменяет там всех художников, больше художники не нужны. Там в запросе есть стиль, прикол. Ну, то есть, как я понял, ну да, он основывается типа на тех стилей, которые были до этого. Ну вот да, может быть в этом прикол, что типа как создать стиль, вот. Как создать стиль, у людей неплохо получается это делать. Нейросетки этого как бы делать не могут, они просто изучают, но они типа не выдают стиль, они выдают тебе ответ на то, что они знают, что ли. И как бы вот тут проблема, что вроде как вот люди говорят, мы когда вчера говорили про понимание, что такое понимание, это, люди писали, что это, скорее всего, твой жизненный опыт, где ты что-то там проанализировал, в один момент просто пришел этот ответ на вот эти, на какой-то конкретный вопрос, и поэтому ты пришел к этому пониманию вот это. Но... Нет, что ли, такого ощущения, что это так работает? Может быть, это ощущение ложно. Получилось симулировать нервную систему только червя? Это реально? Младенец может распознать сразу вообще каких-либо данных, без вообще каких-либо данных. Прикол. Мне кажется, просто не обязательно симулировать тупо нейроны человека. Наверняка можно найти определенные трюки и это сделать намного проще. Вот. Биологические нейроны. Ну, я вот про это, что не обязательно думать о них как о нейронах, наверное. Просто нейроны — это хорошая подсказка того, что можно, как эту систему собрать и как написать искусственный интеллект. Но нам же не нужно эмулировать гормоны. Типа, зачем это делать? То есть какие-то такие вещи. То есть чуть-чуть нужно, ну, не абстрагироваться, просто принимать эту информацию за данность, ну, и делать по-своему. Я уверен, что Кармак так и делает, скорее всего. Учитывая его опыт с Думом, и учитывая опыт с тем, как он решал проблемы. Что он просто их решал в зависимости, вот тебе задача, вот тебе компьютер, вот тебе как бы то, что у тебя есть, и попробуй ее решить. То есть там ничего лишнего. То есть, возможно, это проблема. То есть нам, возможно, не обязательно нейроны эти эмулировать, симулировать. Может быть, все намного проще. Скорее всего. Ну, это он уже сказал сам.
That's going through a lifelong learning process.
А по поводу того, что похоже, как нейросетки и так далее люди работают, наверное, но не совсем. Ну, то есть, похоже, но нет. Ну, типа, это не оно, типа, одно и то же. Нет, я бы не сказал. Вообще нет. Ну, может быть и так примерно, но у нас очень много всяких разных сигналов, которые мы получаем по-своему во времени, в условиях, в которых мы находимся. Невероятное количество вообще сигналов визуальных, тепловых, там, звуковых, не знаю, гравитационных или каких в плане веса и прочее. То есть, и это на нас все влияет вообще. Плюсом социальных, опять же, то, что мы общаемся, плюсом язык. Наверное, как нейросеть, да, то есть мы берем этот весь опыт. Ну, типа, наверное, не совсем то. Типа того. Ну, у меня, по крайней мере, такие ощущения. Не знаю, я не могу, короче, словами писать.
Want something that kind of gives signs of a being. Like, what's the difference between a neural network, a feed-forward neural network, and a being? Where's the
fundamentally, the brain is a recurrent neural network generating an action policy. I mean, it's implemented on a biological substrate. And it's interesting thinking about things like that, where we know fundamentally the brain is not a convolutional neural network or a transformer. Those are specialized things that are very valuable for what we're doing, but it's not the way the brain's doing. Now, I do think consciousness and AI in general is a substrate independent mechanism where it doesn't have to be implemented the way the brain is. But if you've only got one existence proof, there's certainly some value in caring about what it says and does. And so the idea that anything that can be done with a narrow AI that you can quantify up a loss function for...
Ну да, вот он сказал, что, наверное, сознание — это немножечко другое. То есть, как бы, сеть — это скорее про хранение памяти и вычисления. А вот сознание, над этим нужно больше думать. Типа с сетью и ну, то есть у нас уже компы есть, да, типа мы храним информацию, и вполне как-то естественным образом получилось так, что вот уже нейронки появились. То есть у нас, в принципе, для этого все есть. Осталось более как-то оптимизирование это все делать, чтобы это все быстрее работало. Как раз-таки там и код лучше писать, и лучше железо использовать, и прочее. Да, а вот с сознанием как бы есть вот загвоздочка.
Mechanism, you're almost certainly going to be able to produce something that's more resource effective to train and deploy and use in an inference mode, train a whole lot and use in an inference. But a living being is going to be something that's a continuous, lifelong learned, task agnostic thing. And
so the lifelong learning is really important too, and the long-term memory. So memory is a big weird part of that puzzle.
And we've got again, I have all the respect in the world for the amazing things that are being done now, but sometimes they can be taken a little bit out of context with things like there's some smoke and mirrors going on, like the Gato, the recent work, the multitask learning stuff. It's amazing that it's one model that plays all the Atari games, as well as doing all of these other things. But of course, it didn't learn to do all of those. It was instructed in doing that by other reinforcement learners going through and doing that. And even in the case of all the games, it's still going.
В давние времена это буквально означало совокупность знаний с психологией. Ну, я бы не так не сказал, типа, тяжело ответить на вопрос, кто я.
With a specific hand-coded reward fund. Even in the case of all the games, it's still going with a specific hand-coded reward function in each of those Atari games, where it's not that, how does it just wants to spend its summer afternoon playing Atari because that's the most interesting thing for it. So it's, again, it's not learning the way humans learn. And there's, I believe, a lot of things that are.
Гены? Не думаю. Гены это всего лишь типа набор характеристик. Типа там, это буквально типа ты начинаешь РПГ, и у тебя просто миксуется вся эта штука, и вуаля, вот, плюс-минус. Но не гены, нет.
It's not learning because that's the most interesting thing for it. So it's, again, it's not learning the way humans.
Не, и я думаю, что это не опыт в том числе, потому что почему, если у меня доказательства какие-то? Ну, наверное, это то, как детей тренируют, то есть они сначала одни, потом их тренируют, и они, например, куда-то вообще в другую сторону уходят, и, допустим, когда растут, в смысле, человек, когда растет, когда ребенком, он куда-то в другую, его как-то не так, может быть, натренировали, или то, что в каких-то он условиях был, и, короче, и куда-то уходит, что это, что-то странное из человека получается. Ну, не странное, а как это... Что он получается каким-то человеком, которое люди наслоили на него что-то, что это не он сам, я не знаю, наверное. Ну, знаете, как люди надевают маски, чтобы в один момент быть таким, а в другой момент быть таким, но это типа не он сам, вот. И есть что-то в сознании, или типа в человеке, или то, как он действует, что как бы отдельно от опыта, который он получает. Шиза? Не, я не про раздвоение или что-то там вроде. Не, я имею в виду то, как люди типа... как это объяснить-то? Наверное, ведут себя так, как они не хотели бы вести, но почему-то так ведут, потому что так научились, или так убедили себя, или еще какая-то хрень. Может, сделан аналог генов, осознание само по себе возникнет? Не, я не думаю, что гены здесь вообще при чем-то. По-своему, из-за генов и предрасположенность, поэтому у каждого получается свое уникальное знание. Неокортекс рефлексия над животным мозгом, типа над рептилоидным мозгом, конечно. Ну, я понял. Может быть. Не уверен, не знаю.
Humans learn. And there's, I believe, it's not learning the way humans learn. And there's, I believe, a lot of things that are challenging to make a loss function for that you can train through these existing conventional things. We're going to chip away at all the things that people do that we can turn into narrow AI problems, and billions of, probably trillions of dollars of value are going to be created by that. But there's still going to be a set of things, and we've got questionable cases like the self-driving car.
Ну вот такой вопрос. Можно ли как-то написать искусственный интеллект, представить себе искусственный интеллект, который не обижается вообще? То есть представьте себе человека, который не обижается, окей. Почему же люди их трясет или они вскипают, если их обидеть? Типа, почему это происходит? То есть они получают какой-то определенный набор символов и значений, из-за чего у них такая реакция в организме происходит. Окей, допустим, это гормоны, там, эмоции и так далее. Почему тогда животные тоже обижаются? То есть как вот, почему? То есть я вот лично такую закономерность заметил, что вот эта эмоция в плане обиды, она есть у всех. Ну, то есть у животных там, условно, там, не знаю, у собак или там у кошек. Что значит обижаются? Когда, наверное, у организма меняется настроение, что ли, потому что этот организм не получил то, что он хотел, возможно. И он реагирует, ну, не реагирует, а как это... Да, это хороший вопрос, типа, как объяснить обиду. Есть же понятие то, что еще можно зарывать, опять же, обиду, то есть какие-то такие вещи. Инстинктом самосохранения может быть. Ну или знаете, какой же пример привести? Ну, как с ребенком, опять же, да, что он может, например, кричать, чтобы привлекать внимание, или он что-то хотел сделать, но у него не получилось, поэтому он кричит, чтобы вызвать как бы какую-то реакцию и подает этот сигнал, чтобы он мог начать манипулировать и получить эту вещь. Вот. Но если ребенка этому не учить, не реагировать на сигналы, он как бы становится более самостоятельным. Вроде бы. Построение ожиданий, наблюдение действий, поведения, сравнение, принятие решений о реакции. Более закрытым. Не, если он взрывает эту как раз-таки обиду, тогда закрытым, наверное, становится, это правда. Но если типа... Я не знаю, как сформулировать. Но, да, ну вот, короче, есть что-то в этой штуке, в этой обиде, что... По какой-то причине тормозит, как будто мне кажется, что оно тормозит твою эффективность обучения, вот, и решать задачи, как будто бы. И как будто бы это какой-то определенный, метод для того, чтобы манипулировать вещами, чтобы, получать какие-то вещи, это, скорее всего, да, типа самосохранение, типа связано с самосохранением, чтобы ты мог поесть и прочее. Ну и жить дальше.
Where it's possible, it's not my bet, but it's plausible that the long tail could be problematic enough that really does require a full-on artificial general intelligence. The counter argument is that data solves almost everything is an interpolation problem if you have enough data, and Tesla may be able to get enough data from all of their deployed stuff to be able to work like that, but maybe not. And there are all the other problems about, like, say you want to have a strategy meeting and you want to go ahead and bring in all of your remote workers and your consultants, and you want a world where some of those could be AIs that are talking and interacting with you in an area that is too murky to have a crisp loss function, but they still have things that on some level they're rewarded on some internal level for building a valuable to humans kind of life and ability to interact with things.
See, I still think that self-driving cars solving that problem will take us very far towards AGI. You might not need AGI, but I am really inspired by what Autopilot is doing. Waymo, some of the other companies, I think Waymo leads the way there, is also really interesting, but they don't have quite as ambitious of an effort in terms of learning-based, sort of data-hungry approach to driving, which I think is very close to the kind of thing that would take us far towards AGI.
Yeah, and it's a funny thing because as far as I can tell, Elon is completely serious about all of his concerns about AGI, being an existential threat. And I tried to draw him out to talk about AI, and he just didn't want to. And I think that I get that little fatalistic sense from him. And it's weird because his company could very well be the leading company leading towards a lot of that, where Tesla being a super pragmatic company that's doing things because they really want to solve this actual problem. It's a different vibe than the research-oriented companies, where it's a great time to be an AI researcher. You've got your pick of trillion-dollar companies that will pay you to kind of work on the problems you're interested in, but that's not necessarily driving hard towards the core problem of AGI as something that's going to produce a lot of value by doing things that that people currently do or would like to do.
I mean, I have a million questions to you about your ideas about AGI, but do you think it needs to be embodied? Do you think it needs to have a body to start to notice the signs of life and to develop the kind of system that's able to perceive the world in the way that an AGI should and act in the world? So should we be thinking about robots, or can this be achieved in a purely digital system?
So I have a clear opinion on that, and that's that no, it does not need to be embodied in the physical world, where you could say most of my career is about making simulated virtual worlds,
Sure.
in games or virtual reality. And so on a fundamental level, I believe that you can make a simulated environment that provides much of the value of what the real environment does. And restricting yourself to operating at real time in the physical world with physical objects, I think, is an enormous handicap. I mean, that's one of the real lessons driven home by all my aerospace work, is that, reality is a bitch in so many ways there. We're dealing with all the mechanical components, like everything fails. Murphy's Law, even if you've done it right before, on your fifth one, it might come out differently. So yeah, I think that anybody that is all in on the embodied aspect of it, they are tying a huge weight to their ankles. And I think that I would almost count them out. Anybody that's making that a cornerstone of their belief about it, I would almost write them off as being worried about them getting to AGI first. I was very surprised that Elon's big on the humanoid robots. I mean, like the NASA Robonaut stuff was always almost a gag line. Like, what are you doing, people?
Well, that's very interesting because he has a very pragmatic view of that. That's just a way to solve a particular problem in a factory.
Now, I do think that once you have an AGI, robotic bodies, humanoid bodies are going to be enormously valuable. I just don't think they're helpful getting to AGI.
Well, he has a very sort of practical view, which I disagree with and I argue with him. But it's a practical view that there's, you could transfer the problem of driving to the problem of robotic manipulation, because so much of it is perception. It's perception and action, and it's just a different context. And so you can apply all the same kind of data engine learning processes to a different environment. And so why not apply it to the humanoid robot environment? But I do think that there's a certain magic to the embodied robot.
That may be the thing that finally convinces people.
Yes.
But again, I don't really care that much about convincing people. The world that I'm looking towards is, you go to the website and say, I want 5 Frank 1As to work on my team today. And they all spin up and they start showing up in your Zoom meetings.
To push back, but also to agree with you. But first, to push back, I do think you need to convince people for them to welcome that thing into their life.
I think there's enough businesses that operate on an objective kind of profit loss sort of basis that, I mean, if you look at how many things, again, talking about the world as an evolutionary space there, when you do have free markets and you have entrepreneurs, you're going to have people that are going to be willing to go out and try whatever crazy things. And when it proves to be beneficial, there's fast followers in all sorts of places.
Yeah. And you're saying that, I mean, Quake and VR is a kind of embodiment, but just in a digital world. And if you're able to demonstrate, if you're able to do something productive in that kind of digital reality, then AGI doesn't need to have a body.
Yeah. It's like one of the really practical technical questions that I kind of keep arguing with myself over. If you're doing a training and learning and you've got, like, you can watch Sesame Street and you can play Master System games or something, is it enough to have just a video feed that is that video coming in? Or should it literally be on a virtual TV set in a virtual room, even if it's, a simple room, just to have that sense of you're looking at a 2D projection on a screen versus having the screen beamed directly into your retinas? And I think it's possible to maybe get past some of these signs of life of things with the just kind of projected directly into the receptor fields. But eventually, for more kind of human emotional connection for things, probably having some VR room with a lot of screens in it for the AI to be learning in is likely helpful.
And maybe a world of different AIs interacting with each other.
That self-play, I do think, is one of the critical things where socialization-wise, one of the other limitations I set for myself thinking about these is I need something that is at least potentially real time, because it's nice you can always slow down time. You can run on a subscale system and test an algorithm at some lower level. And if you've got extra horsepower, running it faster than real time is a great thing. But I want to be able to have the AIs either socially interact with each other or critically with actual people.
Остальное буду откисать от VR. Не, ну да, почему бы нет. Не, а про метаверс я сначала подумал, я скептически был настроен, я думал, это что-то про Facebook будет рассказывать, но он в общем плане говорил про, типа VR, типа вселенную. В принципе, да.
It's a great thing, some lower level. And if you...
Мы, в принципе, сейчас этим и занимаемся, просто в супер зачатке, с компьютерами. По сути, то же самое. Просто это можно немножечко по-другому, наверное, делать в другом роде и, возможно, даже более удобно.
You've got extra horsepower, running it faster than real time is a great thing. But I want to be able to have the AIs either socially interact with each other or critically with actual people. Your sort of child development psychiatrist that comes in and interacts and does the good boy, bad boy sort of thing as the
Даже ворчать в кинотеатре сидеть очень утомительно.
They're going through and exploring different the good boy, bad boy sort of thing as they're going through and exploring different things. And it's nice I come back to the value of constraints in a lot of ways. And if I say, well, one of my constraints is real-time operation. I mean, it might still be a huge data center full of computers, but it should be able to interact on a Zoom meeting with people. And that's how you also do start convincing people, even if it's not a robot body moving around, which eventually gets to irrefutable levels. Mm-hmm. But if you can go ahead and not just type back and forth to a GPT bot on something, but you're literally talking to them in an embodied over Zoom form and working through problems with them or exploring situations, having conversations that are fully stateful and learned, I think that that's a valuable thing. So I do keep all of my eyes on things that can be implemented within sort of that 30 frames per second kind of work. And I think that's feasible.
Do you think the most compelling experiences that first will be for pleasure or for business, as they ask in airports? So meaning, is it if it's interacting with AI agents, will it be sort of like friends, entertainment, almost like a therapist or whatever, that kind of interaction? Or is it in the business setting, something like you said, brainstorming different ideas? Sort of, this is all a different formulation of kind of a Turing test, or the spirit of the original Turing test. Where do you think the biggest benefit will first come?
So it's going to start off hugely expensive. I mean, if we're still all guessing about what compute is going to be necessary. I fall on the side of, I don't think you run the numbers and you're like 86 billion neurons, 100 trillion synapses. I don't think those all need to be weights. I don't think we need models that are quite that big, evaluated quite that often. I base that on, we've got reasonable estimates of what some parts of the brain do. We don't have the neocortex formula, but we kind of get some of the other sensory processing, and it doesn't feel like we can simulate that in computers for less weights. But still, it's probably going to be thousands of GPUs to be running, a human level AGI. Depending on how it's implemented, that might give you sort of a clan of 128 and kind of run in batch people, depending on whether there's sparsity in the way the
Что у людей нет системной воли, все будущие мысли действия предопределены законы физики, поскольку в физическом мире есть только материя и энергия, а второе сознание физически существует как биохимический процесс мышления в мозге, его можно перенести в компьютер, нет разницы материального носителя. Человека есть иллюзия, что он существует внутри своей головы, это не то же самое, что сознание, эта иллюзия не существует в физическом мире. Может быть, надо просто доказать. Не, ну можно, как в принципе, в математике просто на аксиомах основываться. С физикой тоже все очень сложно, типа, как в плане, время, типа, это, и бесконечность. Сложно сложно некоторые вещи понять и доказать особенно, структурировать. Поэтому да, возможно. Делать ИИ — это не в нас в глубине, не уникально, наоборот, не осознаем свой потенциал. Да, не, я согласен. Я вообще не воспринимаю ИИ как что-то зловещее. И, наверное, даже наоборот. То есть, по сути, наверное, благодаря ИИ у нас просто больше друзей появится. Появится больше друзей, идей того, как что поделать. Вот, наверное, вот так. Я не думаю, что это будет что-то в стиле типа: о, сейчас этот AI появился, он захватил весь мир, типа, бля, нет. Нет, вообще нет, это не то. Да, мне кажется, это просто будет веселее, просто больше интересных вещей, больше разных каких-то открытий, возможностей, и просто больше друзей будет. Вот, да, это будет определенно весело, когда уже хоть какой-то AI появится. Поэтому людям и сейчас особенно, типа, ой, интересно, там появилась какая-то нейросетка, которая, типа, составляет тебе приключения, ты играешь. Или, есть какой-то, может быть, что-то ты говоришь, и он что-то, какой-то ответ дает, но ты понимаешь, что этот ответ, наверное, был предопределен, или, не знаю, это просто статистикой было решено, или что-то усредненное. То есть людям есть какой-то импульс определенный того, что ты хочешь найти друзей, что ли. Не обязательно хочешь, может быть, пофиг вообще, не знаю. Наверное, как-то так.
And kind of run by. Depending on how it's implemented, that might give you sort of a clan of 128 and kind of run in batch people, depending on whether there's sparsity in the way the weights and things are set up. If it is a reasonably dense thing, then just the memory bandwidth trade-offs means you get 128 of them at the same time. And either it's all feeding together, learning in parallel, or kind of all running together, kind of talking to a bunch of people. But still, if you've got thousands of GPUs,
Для чего AI Dungeon используют?
together, and either it's all feeding together, learning in parallel, or kind of all running together, kind of talking to a bunch of people. But still, if you've got thousands of GPUs necessary to run these things, it's going to be kind of expensive, where it might start off $1,000 an hour for your, even post-development or something for that, which would be something that you would only use for a business, something where you think they're going to help you make a strategic decision or point out something super important. But I also am completely confident that we will have another factor of 1,000 in cost performance increase in AGI type calculations. Not in general computing necessarily, but there's so much more that we can do with packaging, making those right trade-offs, all those same types of things that in the next couple decades, 1,000x easy. And then you're down to $1.
Сохранить это во вселенной интеллект мы сможем друзей, это прикольно, но и может так, что... то есть, да, наверное, я до сих пор не знаю, не уверен, мы то То есть как бы мы потом как отпадем, как вид, и просто ИИ дальше продолжит как бы, ну, передадим им флаг в руки. Но такое ощущение, что, наверное, это будет что-то вроде плюс друзья, и мы типа под руку скорее будем идти, наверное, так, с искусственным интеллектом. То есть больше вероятность, что скорее, то есть оно как мы пытаемся создать друзей для того, чтобы, может быть, найти друзей еще где-то там дальше в космосе, типа того. Вот. Это как бы приключение, которое только начинается, и нам нужна, так сказать, команда, образно говоря, и мы ее начинаем как-то собирать, но скорее даже как-то создавать, и благодаря ней вот у нас получится решать очень сложные задачи.
An hour. And then you're kind of like, well, I should have an entourage of AIs that are, following me around, helping me out on anything that I want them to do.
That's one interesting trajectory, but I'll push back because I have in that case, if you want to pay thousands of dollars, it should actually provide some value.
Иллюзию существенно невозможно объяснить, так что вопрос, почему существует мир вообще. Ну да, может быть, это вопросы, типа, на которые можно забить.
I think it's easier. The dollars, it should actually provide some value. I think it's easier for cheaper to provide value via a dumb AI that will take us towards AGI to just have a friend. I think there's an ocean of loneliness in the world. And I think an effective friend that doesn't have to be perfect, that doesn't have to be intelligent, that has to be empathic, having emotional intelligence, having ability to remember things, having ability to listen. Most of us don't listen to each other. One of the things that love, and when you care about somebody, when you love somebody, is when you listen. And that is something we treasure about each other. And if an AI can do that kind of thing, I think that provides a huge amount of value, and very importantly, provides value in its ability to listen and understand versus provide really good advice. I think providing really good advice is very is another next level step that would I think it's just easier to do companionship.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, I think that there's very few things that I would argue can't be reduced to some kind of a narrow AI. Yeah. I think we can do $1 trillion of value easily, and all the things that can be done there. And a lot of it can be done with smoke and mirrors without having to go the whole thing. I mean, there's going to be the equivalent of the Doom, the Doom version for the AGI that's not really AGI, it's all smoke and mirrors, but it happens to do enough valuable things that it's enormously useful and valuable to people. But at some point, you do want to get to the point where you have the fully general thing and you stop making bespoke specialized systems for each thing, and you wind up start using the higher level language instead of writing everything in assembly language.
What about consciousness? The C word, do you think that's fundamental to solving AGI, or is it a quirk of human cognition?
So I think most of the arguments about consciousness don't have a whole lot of merit. I think that consciousness is kind of the way the brain feels when it's operating.
Yes.
And is kind of the way the brain feels when it's operating.
Yes.
And this idea that, I do generally subscribe to sort of the pandemonium theories of consciousness where there's all these things bubbling around. And I think of them as kind of slightly randomized, sparse distributed memory bit strings of things that are kind of happening, recalling different associative memories. And eventually you get some level of consensus and it bubbles up to the point of being a conscious thought there. And the little bits of stochasticity that are sitting on in this as it cycles between different things and recalls different memory, that's largely our imagination and creativity. So I don't think there's anything deeply magical about it, certainly not symbolic. I think it is generally the flow of these associations drawn up with stochastic noise overlaid on top of them. And I think so much of that is like it depends on what you happen to have in your field of view as some other thought was occurring to you that overlay and blend into the next key that queries your memory for things. And that kind of determines how, how your chain of consciousness goes.
So that's kind of the qualia, the subjective experience of it is not essential for
I
intelligence.
don't think so. I don't think there's anything really important there.
What about some other human qualities like fear of mortality and stuff like that? Like the fact that this ride ends, is that important? Like we talked so much throughout this conversation about the value of deadlines and constraints. Do you think that's important for intelligence?
That's actually a super interesting angle that I don't usually take on that about has death being a deadline that forces you to make better decisions.
Блин, наушники сели.
That I don't usually take on that about has death being a deadline that forces.
Окей. Это я до чая. Сейчас буду. Смотрите, ребят, у меня к вам два вопроса. По поводу этого сознания. Короче, первый вопрос. Как вы считаете, если мы возьмем сознание и типа перенесем его в машину, ну как-то сохраним его, да, что свое сознание, что это мы его сохраняем где-то, то это будет, вы как будто бы реально туда переезжаете, да, то есть вы там закрыли глаза, проснулись, вы там оказались, да, это вы. Или Б, вы просто себя скопируете, и как бы вас двое становится, что один там, а вы все еще типа здесь. То есть А или Б. Ну вот да. И второй вопрос как раз-таки. А как бы вы хотели, чтобы было? А или Б? Ну, да. Кто-то Б. По многим причинам. Прикол. Хуй знает. Спасибо большое. Не, второй был вопрос просто про хотение. Два человека идентично кому-то понравится нам. Ну, смотрите. Ну, окей. То есть, скорее всего, большинство будет хотеть, чтобы был вариант А, например, чтобы избежать смерти. Потому что мы не знаем, что там. И, может быть, это просто, типа, выкол и все. Конец. Но если людям хочется добиться такого варианта, то, скорее всего, он возможен. Ну, разве нет? Хотя сейчас все говорит о том, что это просто копия. Но я не говорю, знаете, как это бывает в каких-то антиутопиях. Ты переселяешься в этом мирке, и там ужас, ад, или что-то рай, или какая-то такая херня. Или какое-нибудь черное зеркало. Не-не. Мы говорим о реальности, что там, окей, ты переносишься сюда, потом обратно сюда. Ты как бы можешь гулять туда-сюда, неважно. Ты не застреваешь, типа, на веки вечные где-то там, без этой хуйни. Я же могу смотреть и есть, не паузить. Позвол. Клон автопилот. Ну да, это если мы говорим, наверное, просто, что бы хотелось сделать, скопировать или перенестись. А если мы говорим, когда ситуация, типа, сейчас помрешь, то как бы ты хотел, чтобы произошло, чтобы тебя скопировали, или чтобы ты буквально очнулся там, перенесся?
You to make that goal that I don't.
Do you think that's important for intelligence?
That's actually a super
Правильный человек, наверное, это уже зависит от того, как...
interesting angle that I don't usually take on that about has death being a deadline that forces you to make better decisions.
Yes.
Because I have heard people talk about how if a death actually
Of deadlines and constraints. Do you think that's important for intelligence?
That's actually a super interesting angle that I don't usually take on that, about has death being a deadline that forces you to make better decisions.
Yes.
Because I have heard people talk about how if you have immortality, people are going to stop trying and working on things because they've got all the time in the world.
Yeah.
But I would say that I don't expect it to be a super critical thing, that a sense of mortality and death, impending death, is necessary there, because those are things that they do wind up providing reward signals to us, and we will be in control of the reward signals. And there will have to be something fundamental that engenders curiosity and goal setting and all of that. Something is going to play in there at the reward level, whether it's positive or negative or both. I don't have any strong opinions on exactly what it's going to be, but that's that type of thing where I doubt that might be one of those half dozen key things that has to be sorted out on exactly what the master reward, that's the meta reward over all of the local task specific rewards, have to be.
That could be that big negative reward of death. Maybe not death, but ability to walk away from an interaction. So it bothers not death, but
have to be.
That could be that big negative reward of death. Maybe not death, but ability to walk away from an interaction. So it bothers me when people treat AI systems like servants. So it doesn't bother me, but I mean, it really is drawing the line between what an AI system could be. It's limiting the possibility of what an AI system could be. It's treating them as just as tools. Now, that's, of course, from a narrow AI perspective, there's so many problems that narrow AI could solve, just like you said, as in its form of a tool. But it could also be a being, which is much more than a tool. And to become a being, you have to respect that thing for being a being, and for that, it has to be able to have to make its own decisions, to walk away, to say, "I had enough of you. I would like to break up with you now. You've not treated me well, and I would like to move on." So I think that actually that choice to end things.
So a couple of things on that. So on the one hand, it is kind of disturbing when you see people being like people that are mean to robots and, mean to Alexa and whatever. And that seems to speak badly about humanity. But there's also the exact opposite side of that, where you have so many people that imbue humanity in inanimate objects or things that are toys or that are relatively limited. So I think there may even be more danger about people putting more emotional investment into a lot of these proto AIs in different ways.
Yeah. And then the AI would manipulate that. But
as far as like the AI ethics sides of things,
yes.
I really stay away from any of those discussions or even really thinking about it. It's similar with the safety things, where I think it's just premature.
Yeah.
And there's a certain class of people that enjoy thinking about impractical things that are not in the world and of pragmatic effect around you. And I think that again, because I don't think there's going to be a fast takeoff. I think we actually will have time to have these debates when we know the shape of what we're debating. And some people do take a principled approach that they think it's going to go too fast, that you really do need to get ahead of it, that you need to be thinking about this because we have slow processes of coming to any kind of consensuses or even coming up with ideas about this. And maybe that's true. I wouldn't put any of my money or funding into something like that because I don't think it's a problem yet. And I think that we will have these signs of life. When we've got our learning disabled toddler, we should really start talking about some of the safety and ethics issues, but probably not before then.
Can you elaborate briefly about why you don't think there'll be a fast takeoff? Is there some deep intuition you have about it? Is it because it's grounded in the physical world, or why?
Yeah, so it is my belief that we're going to start off with something that requires thousands of GPUs. And I don't know if you've tried to go get 1,000 GPU instance on a cloud anytime recently, but these are not things that you can just go spin up hundreds of. There are real challenges these things are going to take data centers, and data centers take years to build, and the last few years, we've seen a few of them kind of coming up, going in different places. They're big engineering efforts. You can hear people bemoan about the fact that, oh, the network was wired all wrong and it took them a month to go unwire it and rewire it the right way. These aren't things that you can just magic into existence. And the ideas of like the old tropes about it's going to escape onto the internet and take over other systems. There's the fast takeoff ones are clearly nonsense because you just can't open TCP connections above a certain rate, no matter how smart you are, even if you have perfect hacking ability. That take over the world in an instant sort of thing just isn't plausible at all. And even if you had access to all of the resources, these are going to be specialized systems where you're going to wind up with something that is architected around exactly this chip with this interconnect, and it's not just going to be able to be plopped somewhere else. Now, interestingly, it is going to be something that the entire code for all of it will easily fit on a thumb drive. That's total spy movie thriller sorts of things where you could have, hey, we cracked the secret to AGI and it fits on this thumb drive and anyone could steal it. Now they're still gonna have to build the right data center to deploy it and have the right kind of life experience curriculum to take it up to the point where it's valuable. But the real core of it, the magic that's gonna happen there is going to be very small. It's again, tens of thousands of lines of code, not millions of lines of code.
It is possible to imagine a world, as you mentioned, in the spy thriller view, if it's just a few lines of code. We can imagine a world where the surface of computation is growing, maybe growing exponentially, meaning there's, the refrigerators start getting a GPU. And just first of all, the smartphones, the billions of smartphones, but maybe
Хорошее интервью вынести, что каждый для себя вынесет что-то отсюда. Можно ограничить условно дилетантов от индивидуализации. Вот так, вот тут как раз проскочил вопрос про то, что ИИ могут назначить гипотетически считаться существами. Интересно, что скажешь? Я не совсем, понял вопроса. Дилетантов ограничить от индивидуализации, я не совсем понял. Сейчас буду, я чай налью. понял.
Be if
Упс, почему один наушник работает? Что? Могут претендовать на статус чего-то мыслящего, поэтому появилась такая идея, как обычный человек, как можно обычных людей, которые могут начинать считать и мыслящим сущностью, предостеречь от этого. Так нет, и смысл и как раз-таки в том, что это мыслящее. Это не про то, что что это был робот, и у него были такие функции, но что-то произошло в нем внутри, и он понял, что он мыслит. То есть, не, он изначально мыслит, это просто типа человек. Типа в этом прикол. Так что там скорее вопрос был про то, что, если я тебя правильно понял, что, люди начнут их типа использовать как целенаправленно использовать их как слуг, хотелось бы, чтобы они у них своя воля была, они сами разбирались, что они хотят. Ну и Кармак ответил, что да, некоторые люди, наверное, так будут поступать, но и люди, по сути, как бы, ну или то, как обращаются некоторые люди даже сейчас там с роботами или с нейросетками, типа Алекса или типа как Алиса, как у нас. Да, это просто люди себя с плохой стороны показывают, но также есть люди, которые показывают себя с хорошей стороны, так что поделать? Итог подводить по окончанию просмотра. Да не, какой итог? У меня пару вещей, которые Кармак сказал, мне типа пригодятся в том, чем я буду заниматься. Самая главная вещь была, которая мне очень понравилась, по сути, ну, я понял для себя. Он делал, когда он программировал, делал свои вещи, делал свою работу, он, по сути, просто делал работу. Нет какого-то магического вот этого. Почему, откуда вообще, блядь, это ощущение, модель этого мышления появилась, не знаю. Что ты должен уйти в горы на 70 лет, тренироваться там чему-то чтобы прийти и сделать этот один удар. Ну, точнее, не совсем. Как бы тренироваться ты все равно будешь, да, ты все равно будешь мастером там своего дела, если ты в него тренируешься. Я скорее не про это, а про то, что... Что ж пример-то принести? Ну вот, чтобы начать делать программирование, тебе нужно 70 лет учить C++. И ты будешь учить и смотреть, и будешь перечитывать документацию C++. Вы знаете, как бывает это на уроках объясняют. И ты должен знать все алгоритмы всего и все шаблоны, и тогда ты сможешь в таком случае зайти и начать кодить C++. Ну, типа нет. То есть, как бы я это понимал, это было подтверждение, но только еще и Кармак подтвердил, что он пока, когда он делал игры, у него там не было какие-то сложные математические формулы, на которые ему пришлось потратить годы и годы, чтобы понять их, решая их в тетрадке, задачи эти все. Не, у него там была какая-то информация, как раз-таки, которую он получил в школе, что-то плюс связанное с линейной алгеброй, типа все, он типа мог идти по своему пути, как бы уже с этой информацией и дальше уже развиваться так, как он хотел. Тренировки бокса нужно посмотреть, чтобы стать профессиональным боксером. Стать профессиональным боксером. Чтобы стать профессиональным боксером, там нужно сразу начать быть профессиональным боксером. Ну да, то есть, типа, надо начать. Типа того. Отдельные права ИИ. Да, наверное, это будет обсуждаться потом. Ну и как Карма говорит, что люди переживают, что ИИ сейчас захватит весь мир и все такое. Там нужно быть осторожным, все такое. Ну, наверное, ну да, клево то, что есть, что мы понимаем, что такое, наверное, возможно, но типа зачем заниматься тем, что нужно будет уже по факту заниматься, то есть в плане безопасности. И будут принадлежать производителям. Ну это уже посмотрим, как у нас все пойдет. И навряд ли компании сделают ИИ. Наверное, все эти времена уже как бы ушли. Вот это, что там IBM сделает или военные где-то сделают, и уже, наверное, уже сейчас не так все работает. Или в какой-то лаборатории где-то в университете. Наверное, это все еще будет, но как бы люди могут уже самостоятельно справляться благодаря компьютеру и интернету.
First of all, the smartphones, GPU, and the surface of computation is growing, maybe growing exponentially.
Лаборатория на Твиче. Ну да, ну то есть, наверное, я не говорю про open проекты. Не знаю, короче, какую мысль я хотел сказать. То, что я стримлю, и когда, например, чему-то обучаюсь или что-то смотрю, Twitch, чат, вы, ребята, вы для меня конкретно, с моей стороны, выглядит это как более, типа, более производительный поиск, чем если бы я сейчас пошел, начал убивать в Гугле и что-то там то-то искать. Просто очень производительный поиск. Наверное, эту роль как раз-таки тоже преподаватели выполняют, что ты быстрее, типа, находишь это, а не там изучаешь сам, да, ищешь эти все ссылки, куда, чего идти, какие пазлы эти собираешь из разных книжек и прочего того, что ты читаешь. Но у тебя как бы есть короткий путь, и ты быстрее эту информацию можешь получить. Не инструмент, потому что люди, которые делятся этой информацией, они ее закрепляют дополнительно, получается. Чат и...
Meaning, there's, the refrigerators start getting a GPU. And first of all, the smartphones, the billions of smartphones. But maybe if there become highways through which code can spread across the entirety, through which code can spread across the entirety of the computation surface, then you don't any longer have to book AWS GPUs.
But there are real fundamental issues there. When you start getting down to taking an actual problem and putting it on an abstract machine like that, that has not worked out well in practice. And the idea that there was always, like, it's always been easy to come up with ways to get compute faster, to say more flops or more giga ops or whatever there. That's usually the easy part. But you then have interconnect and then memory for what goes into it. And when you talk about saying, well, cell phones, well, you're limited to like a 5G connection or something on that. And if you say if you take your calculation and you factor it across 1 million cell phones instead of 1,000 GPUs in a warehouse, you might be able to have some kind of a substrate like that, but it could be operating then at 1/1000th the speed. And so, yes, you could have an AGI working there, but it wouldn't be a real-time AGI. It would be something that is operating at really a snail's pace, much, much slower than kind of human-level thought for things.
Yeah.
So I'm not worried about that problem.
You're transferring the problem into the interconnect, the communication, the shared memory, the collective intelligence aspect of it, which is extremely difficult as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's back to the very earliest days of supercomputers. You still have the balance between bandwidth, storage, and computation. And sometimes they're easier to get one or the other, but it's been remarkably constant across all those years that you still need all three. Constant. And sometimes the balance between bandwidth, storage, and computation. And sometimes they're easier to get one or the other, but it's been remarkably constant across all those years that you still need all three.
What do your efforts now, you mentioned to me that you're really committing to AI at this stage. What do you see your life in the next few months, years look like? What do you hope to achieve here?
So I literally just this week signed a term sheet to take some investment money for my company, where the last 2 years
у него отдельная компания, ебой, охуенно.
I had to take some investment money for my company, where the last 2 years I had backed off from Meta and I was still doing my consulting CTO.
Окей, да, он типа потихоньку отходит. Бля, я очень рад за него. Класс.
Years I had backed off from Meta and I was still doing my consulting CTO role there, but I had styled it as I was going to take the Victorian gentleman scientist route, where I was
Yes.
going to be the the wealthy person that was going to go pursue science and learn about this and do experiments. And honestly, I'm surprised there aren't more people like that, that are like me, technical people that made a bunch of money and are interested in some of these, possibly the biggest leverage point in human history. I mean, I've heard of a couple organizations that are basically led by one rich techie guy that gets a few people around him to try to work on this. But I'm surprised that there's not more, that there aren't like a dozen of them. I mean, maybe people are still think that it's an unapproachable problem, that it's kind of beyond their ability to get a wrench on and have some effect on like whatever startups they've run before. But that was my kind of, like with all the stuff I've learned, whether it's gaming, aerospace, whatever, I go through a larval phase where I'm like, okay, I'm sucking up all of this information, trying to see, is this something that I can actually do? Is this something that's practical to devote a large chunk of my life to? And I've gone through that with the AI machine learning space of things. And I think I've got my arms around it. I've got the measure of it where some of the most brilliant people in the world are working on this problem, but nobody knows exactly the path that it's going on. We're throwing a lot of things at the wall and seeing what sticks. But I have another interesting thing, just learning about all of this, the contingency of your path to knowledge and talking about the associations and the context that you have with them, where people that learn in the same path will have similar thought processes. And I think it's useful that I come at this from a different background, a different history than the people that have had the largely academic backgrounds for this, where I have huge blind spots that they could easily point out, but I have a different set of experiences in history and approaches to problems and systems engineering that that might turn out to be useful. And I can afford to take that bet where I'm not going to be destitute. I have enough money to fund myself working on this for the rest of my life. But what I was finding is that I was still not committing, where I had a foot firmly in the VR and meta side of things, where in theory, I've got a very nice position there. I only have to work 1 day a week for my consulting role, but I was engaging every day. I'd still be like, my computer's there. I'd be going and checking the workplace and notes and testing different things and communicating with people. But I did make the decision recently that no, I'm going to get serious. I'm still going to keep my ties with Meta, but I am seriously going for the AGI side of things.
And it's actually a really interesting point, because a lot of the machine learning, the AI community is quite large, but really, basically almost everybody has taken the same trajectory through life in that community. And it's so interesting to have somebody like you with a fundamentally different trajectory. And that's where the big solutions can come, because there's a kind of silo. And it is a bunch of people kind of following the same kind of set of ideas.
And I was really worried that I didn't want to come off as, like an arrogant outsider for things, where I have all the respect in the world for the work that's, it's been a miracle decade. We're in the midst of a scientific revolution happening now, and everybody doing this is, these are the Einsteins and Bohrs and whatevers of our modern era. And I was really happy to see that the people that I sat down and talked with, everybody does seem to really be quite great about just happy to talk about things, willing to acknowledge that we don't know what we're doing. We're figuring it out as we go along. And I mean, I've got a huge debt on this, where this all really started for me because Sam Altman basically tried to recruit me to OpenAI. Mm-hmm. And it was at a point when I didn't know anything about what was really going on in machine learning. And in fact, it's funny how the first time you reached out to me, it's like 4 years ago for your AI podcast.
Yeah, for people who listening to this should know that, first of all, obviously I've been a huge fan of yours for the longest time, but we've agreed to talk like 4 years ago, back when this was called the Artificial Intelligence Podcast. We wanted to do a thing, and you said yes, and then
I said, it's like, I don't know anything about modern AI.
That's right.
I said I could kind of take an angle on machine perception, because I'm doing a lot of that with the sensors and the virtual reality, but we could probably find something to talk about. But,
and then and that's where, when did Sam talk to you about OpenAI? Around the same time?
No, it was a bit after that. So I had done the...
Таких смайлов. Я не знаю, как они появились, ребята. Что-то произошло, и появился ХДД. И по итогу вот however бот еще накинул басекс ДД, вот это секс все ХДД. Я не знаю, что произошло, ребята, я не понимаю нихуя. А, это у XQC? Прикольно, прикол. Ну, просто в целом, типа, что, как бы, как откуда?
The most
Around the same. And then, so, I mean, and that's where, when did Sam talk to you about OpenAI? Around the same time?
No, it was a little bit. It was a bit after that. So I had done the most basic work. I had kind of done the neural networks from scratch.
Ну, типа, сука, эта картинка много эмоций в себе несет, определенных. А может быть, никаких не несет вообще нихуя.
Where I had done the
AI around the same time?
no, it was a little bit. It was a bit after that. So I had done the most basic work. I had kind of done the neural networks from scratch, where I had gone and written it all in C just to make sure I understood backpropagation at the.
Бля, ну не 5 часов. Не, нормально, кстати, у них вообще все, ну типа, все ровно прошло. Ну да, долго. Я много стопил. Но удивительно, что это, блядь, 5 часов. И они вполне вообще налегке все идет. Супер легко.
The lowest level.
Немного вот на метаверсе чуть такой, ну, нормально.
And my nuts and bolts approach, but after Sam
Но Кармак хорошо провел. Просто Кармак так хорошо говорит. Это пипец.
approached me.
Да, приятно смотреть умного человека, это правда. То есть видно, что я не знаю, просто видно, что он умеет очень точно доносить свою мысль, прям максимально точно. То есть он, ну, как бы этому научился спустя столько лет опыта и так далее, и вот он все ровно говорит, все супер точно, просто пипец. Ну, это круто. Есть чему учиться, восхищаться.
My nuts and bolts approach. Sure, I understood backpropagation at the lowest level, and my nuts and bolts approach. But after Sam approached me, it was flattering to think that he thought that I could be useful at OpenAI, largely for kind of like systems optimization sorts of things.
Карма говорит, там вообще воды не было. То есть вообще, если так подумать, это все. И они 5 часов про это говорили. То есть это говорит о том, что можно сколько угодно говорить, неважно, если у тебя ровно получается доносить. Плюсом, естественно, конечно, интервьюер очень классно построил так все, что он его ведет, и как-то у них разговоры тоже переходили очень ровно в определенные темы. Но да, он прям вообще не... Ну, то есть я не знаю, как это... Мне такому учиться. Это, кстати, сразу, наверное, говорит о том, как он собирает вещи, как он программирует, как он взаимодействует с людьми, ну, в команде, допустим, если мы говорим о работе. То есть, типа, все четко. Каким должен быть обычный человек? Ну, просто этому, да, нужно учиться, но не учиться в плане, типа, академическом плане. Просто нужно, чтобы люди об этом говорили, и чтобы быстрее до людей это доходило, и не тратилось время на какие-то рефлексии, недопонимания и так далее, чтобы все было намного четче, быстрее. Это просто все от этого будет только приятнее, и люди будут больше тратить время на то, что хотят. Обычно, ну, я понял, про что он имеет в плане обычности, что, типа, максимально оптимизированно используются вещи, которые у нас есть. Типа того, ну, как я понял это.
I am AI largely for kind of like systems optimization sorts of things. I am, without being an expert, but I asked, Ilya Sutskever to give me a reading list, and he gave me a binder full of all the papers that, like, okay, these are the important things. If you really read and understand all of these, you'll know like 80% of what most of the machine language researchers work on. And I went through and I read all those papers multiple times and highlighted them and went through and kind of figured the things out there, and then started branching out into my own sets of research on things, and eventually started writing my own experiments and figuring out, finding out what I don't know what the limits of my knowledge are, and kind of figuring out finding out what I don't know, what the limits of my knowledge are, and starting to get some of my angles of attack on things, the things that I think are a little bit different from what people are doing. And I've had a couple years now, like 2 years since I kind of left the full-time position at Meta, and 2 years since I kind of left the full-time position at Meta, and now I've kind of pulled the trigger and said, I'm going to get serious about it, but some of my lessons all the way back to Armadillo Aerospace about how I know I need to be more
То есть
committed
он
to
типа
this.
2 года подготавливался, чтобы изучить все, что там, как, кого, чего, чтобы иметь какой-то этот фундамент и уже начинать от этого строить. Прикольно. 2 года ему понадобилось на это.
Where there is that, it's both a freedom and a cost in some ways when you know that you're wealthy enough to say it's like, this doesn't really mean anything. I can spend $1 million a year for the rest of my life.
Чтобы работало без него. Я понял тебя, чтобы типа развязать все типа связи с мета. Ну, кстати, возможно, да, реально. Вот бы с HDD это использовать. Я нихуя не понимаю последний смайл. Это дичь просто какая-то. Ну окей, давайте. Сейчас. У меня лично пока не появилось. А я точно добавил? Нет. Insufficient privilege. You must be subscribed to use zero width emotes. Zero width. О, нет, бесплатный эмоут. Ой, то есть платный эмоут, ребят. Ой, what the fuck? Zero width? Где, собственно? Платно? Не, я бы с удовольствием заплатил, но вы сами знаете. Я просто не могу, а как, типа, ничего не работает вне. Оно накладывается поверх, походу. Zero width. О, прикольно. Я поэтому подумал, что, типа, было бы прикольно, если что-то внутри телефона было. Но я это не озвучил, типа, оно так оказалось, прикол. Блин, это топ. Ну да. Ладно, давайте я посмотрю, может у них можно, на самом деле. На канале без подписки есть? Да не, если они типа хотят подписку, окей, но проблем, какая у них система оплаты, может быть здесь можно. Но навряд ли. Да, тут просят карты банковские, я не думаю, что... Не, ну я могу попробовать, а вдруг пройдет, это будет смешно. Россия, да, окей. Ну да, окей. Ну, я попробую. Сделать такое лицо, я не знаю. Да, ну, когда-нибудь. Someday over the rainbow. О, они все оранжевые, прикол. О, крипа есть. Клево. У меня не будет
life, and
Ну, вообще там есть, на самом деле, подарочные подписки.
it doesn't mean anything.
Не, если кто-то хочет, может подарить, я без проблем, конечно. Я просто не знаю, как там этот процесс идет.
It's fine. But that is an opportunity
И я, как понимаю, это уже не перманентно, наверное, опять придется обновлять каждый месяц вот это все. Поэтому, наверное, за
and it doesn't mean anything. It's fine. Spend $1 million a year for the rest of my life, and it doesn't mean anything. It's fine. But that is an opportunity to just kind of meander. And I could see that in myself when I'm doing some things. It's like, oh, this is a kind of interesting, curious thing. Let's look at this for a little while. Let's look at that. It's not really bearing down on the problem. So there's a few things that I've done that are kind of tactics for myself to make me more effective. Like one thing I noticed I was not doing well is I had a Google Cloud account with to get GPUs there, and I was finding I was very rarely doing that for no good psychological reasons, where I'm like, oh, I can always think of something to do other than to spin up instances and run an experiment. I can, keep working on my local Titans or something. But it was really stupid. I mean, it was not a lot of money. I should have been running more experiments there. So I thought to myself, well, I'm going to go buy a $250,000 DGX station. I'm going to just sit it right there, and it's going to mock me if I'm not using it.
Yes.
If the fans aren't running on that thing, I'm not properly utilizing it. And that's been helpful. I've done a lot more experiments since then. It's been interesting where I thought I'd be doing all this low-level NVLink optimized stuff, but 90% of what I do is just spin up 4 instances of an experiment with different hyperparameters on it.
Oh, interesting. So you're doing really sort of building up intuition by doing ML experiments of different kinds.
Можно ли назвать ХДД просто Рольфом, который, дошел? Вот, наверное. Нельзя. Да, наверное, нельзя. Это немножечко другое. Все можно, хорошо.
Sort of building up intuition by doing ML experiments of different kinds.
But so the next big thing
By doing ML experiments. So you're doing
Через 7 ТВ Next. Да там... Не, я пас, спасибо. Не знаю. Это вроде от них же сайт, да, я понимаю, но он такой стрёмный, я даже заходить на него не хочу. Спасибо.
really.
different hyperparameters on it.
Oh, interesting. So you're doing really sort of building up intuition by doing ML experiments of different kinds.
But so the next big thing though is I decided that I was going to take some investor money because I have an overactive sense of responsibility about other people's money. And it's like I don't want. I mean, a lot of my push and my passionate entreaties for things at Meta are. It's like I don't want Zuck to have wasted his money investing in Oculus. I want it to work out. I want it to change the world. I want it to be worth all of this time, money, and effort going into it. And I expect that it's going to be like that with my company, where
It's a huge forcing function. This
I
investment.
have investors that are going to expect something of me. Now, we've all had the conversation that this is a low probability long-term bet. It's not something that there's a million things I could do that I would have line of sight on the value proposition for. This isn't that. I think there are unknown unknowns in the way, but it's one of these things that it's hyperbole, but it's potentially one of the most important things humans ever do. And it's something that I think is within our lifetimes, if not within a decade, to happen. So yeah, this is just now happening. Like term sheet, like the ink is barely, virtual ink's barely dry on
It's drying. I mean, as I mentioned to you offline, like somebody I admire, somebody Andre Karpathy. I think the two of you different trajectories in life, but approach problems similarly in that he codes stuff from scratch up all the time, and he's created a bunch of little things outside of even outside the course at Stanford that have been tremendously useful to build up intuition about stuff, but also to help people, and they're all in the realm of AI. Do you see yourself potentially doing things like this, or not necessarily solving a gigantic problem, but on the journey, on the path to that, building up intuitions and sharing code or ideas or systems that give inklings of AGI but also kind of are useful to people in some way.
So yeah, first of all, Andre is awesome. I learned a lot when I was going through my larval phase from his blog posts and his Stanford course, and super valuable. I got to meet him first a couple years ago when I was first kind of starting off on my gentleman scientist bit, and just a couple months ago when he went out on his sabbatical, he stopped by in Dallas and we talked for a while, and I had a great time with him. And then when I heard he actually left Tesla, I did, of course, along with 100 other people, say, hey, if you ever want to work with me, it would be an honor.
Yeah.
So he thinks that he's going to be doing this educational work, but I think someone's going to make him an offer he can't refuse before he gets too far along on it.
Oh, his current interest is educational. It's like, he's a special mind.
Yeah.
Is there something you could speak to what makes him so special?
So,
from your understanding?
He was very much a programmer's programmer that was doing machine learning work rather than, it's a different feel than an academic, where you can see it in papers sometimes where somebody that's really
Противников ХДД, который превратил чат. Не, я пока пас. Спасибо большое. Спасибо огромное. Да, кстати, Деклайдер, если что, я письмо получил, спасибо большое, прости, что не ответил. Я изучу этот вопрос, у нас будет TTS 100%, soon. Надеюсь, то, что я не отвечаю, тебя как бы не напрягает, не нагружает или что-то в этом роде. Так что soon, насколько soon, узнаем. Ну, не в смысле, не там через месяцы, а типа скоро разберусь.
really a mathematician or a statistician at heart, and they're doing something with machine learning. Really a mathematician or a statistician at heart, and they're doing something with machine learning. But Andre is about getting something done, and you could see it in like all of his earliest approaches to. It's like, okay, here's how reinforcement learning works. Here's how recurrent neural networks work. Here's how transformers work. Here's how crypto works, and yeah, it's just, he's a hacker's, one of his old posts was like a hacker's guide to machine learning.
Yeah.
And, he deprecated that and said, don't really pay attention to what's in here. But it's that thought that carries through in a lot of it, where it is that back again to that hacker mentality and the hacker ethic with what he's doing and in sharing all of it.
Yeah. And a lot of his approach to a new thing, like you said, larva stage, is let me code up the simplest possible thing to build up intuition about it.
Yeah, like I say, I sketch with structs and things when I'm just thinking about a problem. I'm thinking in some degree of code.
You are also, among many things, a martial artist, both judo and jiu-jitsu. How has this helped make you the person you are?
So, I was a competent club player in judo and grappling. I was, by no means any kind of a superstar, but I went through a few phases with it where I did some when I was quite young, a little bit more when I was 17. And then I got into it kind of seriously in my mid-30s. And, I went pretty far with it. And I was, pretty good at some of the things that I was doing. And I did appreciate it quite a bit where, on the one hand, it's always, if you're going to do exercise or something, it's a more motivating form of exercise. If someone is crushing you, you're motivated to do something about that, to up your attributes and be better about getting out of that.
Attributes, yes.
But there's also that sense that I was not a sports guy. I did do wrestling in junior high, and I often wish that I think I would have been good for me if I'd carried that on into high school and had a little bit more of that. It's like I filch a little bit of wrestling vibe with always going on about embracing the grind and like that push that I associate with the wrestling team that in hindsight, I wish I had gone through that and pushed myself that way. But even getting back into judo and jiu-jitsu in my mid-30s as usually the old man on the mat with that, there was still the sense that working out with the group and having the guys that you're beating each other up with it, but you just feel good coming out of it. And I can remember those driving home, aching in various ways, and just thinking it's like, oh, that was really great. And it's mixing with a bunch of people that had nothing to do with any of the things that I worked with. Every once in a while, someone would be like, "Oh, you're the Doom guy," and but for the most part, it was just different slice of life. A good thing. And I made the call when I was 40. That's like, maybe I'm getting a little
Ну, мы
old for
вчера
this.
разобрались, то, что, видимо, проблемы повлияли, что, наверное, ребята там чем-то хотели другим заниматься, Ромеро и все такое, но там был чел, который, видимо, очень хотел по головам пройтись, и, кстати, у него по итогу получилось, но да, вот как-то так. Вот, Snake.
That I worked with. Every once in a while, someone would be like, "Oh, you're the Doom guy," and but for the most part, it was just different slice of life. A good thing. And I made the call when I was 40. That's like, maybe I'm getting a little old for this. I had separated a rib and tweaked a few things, and I got out of it without any really bad injuries. And it was like, have I dodged enough bullets? Should I hang it up? I went back. I've gone a couple times in the last decade trying to get my kids into it a little bit. I didn't really stick with any of them, but it was fun to get back on the mats. It really hurts for a while when you haven't gone for a while, but I still debate this pretty constantly. My brother's only a year younger than me, and he's going kind of hard in jiu-jitsu right now. And he won a few medals at the last tournament he was at.
So he's competing too.
Yeah. And I was thinking, I guess we're in the executive division if you're over 50, or over 45 or something. And it's not out of the question that I'd go back at some point and do some of this. But again, I'm just reorganizing my life around more focus. Probably not going to happen. I'm pushing my exercise around to give me longer, uninterrupted intellectual focus time, pushing it to the beginning or the end of the
running
game.
And stuff like that, walking.
Yeah, I got running and calisthenics and some things like that. But
it allows you to still think about a problem.
But if you're going to a judo club or something, you've got it fixed. It's going to be 7 o'clock or whatever, 10 o'clock on Saturday. Although I talked about this a little bit when I was on Rogan, and shortly after that, Carlos Machado did reach out, and I had trained with him for years back in the day, and he was like, "Hey, we've got kind of a small private club with a bunch of kind of executive type people," and it does tempt me.
Yeah, I don't know if you know him, but John Danaher moved here to Austin with Gordon Ryan and a few other folks, and he has a very interesting way, very deep, systematic way of thinking about jiu-jitsu that reveals the chess of it, the science of it.
And I do think about that more as kind of an older person considering the martial arts, where I can remember the very earliest days getting back into judo, and I'm like, teach me submissions right now.
Right.
It's like, learn the arm bar, learn the choke. But as you get older, you start thinking more about, it's like, okay, I really do want to like learn the entire canon of judo, just like all the different things there and like all the different approaches for it. Not just if you want to compete, there's just a handful of things you learn really, really well. But sometimes there's interest in learning a little bit more of the scope there and figuring some things out from, at one point wasn't exactly a spreadsheet, but I did have a big long text file with like, here's the things that I learned and here are like ways you chain this together. And when I went back a few years ago, it was good to see that I whipped myself back into reasonable shape about doing the basic grappling, but I know there was a ton of the subtleties that were gone, but could probably be brought back reasonably quickly.
And there's also the benefit. I mean, you're exceptionally successful now. You're brilliant, and the old problem of the ego, is
I still pushed kind of harder than I should. I mean, I was one of those people that I'm on the smaller side for a lot of the people competing, and I would I'd go with all the big guys and I'd go hard and I'd push myself a lot, and that would be one of those where I'd be dangerous to anyone for the first 5 minutes, but then sometimes after that, I'm already dead. And I knew it was terrible for me because it made the it meant I got less training time with all of that when you go and you just gas out, relatively quickly there. And I like to think that I would be better about that, where after I gave up judo, I started doing the half marathons and Tough Mudders and things like that. And so when I did go back to the local judokai club, I thought it's like, oh, I should have better cardio for this because I'm a runner now and I do all of this, and didn't work out that way. It was the same old thing where just push really hard, strain really hard. And of course, when I worked with good guys like Carlos, it's like, just the whole flow like water thing is real. And he's just like...
That's true with judo too. Some of the best people, like I've trained with Olympic gold medalists, and for some reason with them, everything's easier. Everything is, you actually start to feel the science of it, the music of it, the dance of it. Everything is effortless. You understand that there's an art to it. It's not just an exercise.
Yeah, it was interesting where I did go to the Kodokan in Japan, kind of the birthplace of judo and everything. And I remember I rolled with one old guy. I didn't start standing, just started on groundwork newaza. And it was striking how different it was from Carlos. He was better than me, and he got my arm, and I had to tap there. But it was a completely different style where I just felt like I could do nothing. He was just enveloping me and just like slowly ground it down, took my arm and bent it. While with Carlos, he's just loose and free, and you always thought like, oh, you're just going to go grab something, but you never had any chance to do it. But it was very different feeling.
That's a good summary of the difference between jiu-jitsu and judo. In jiu-jitsu, it is a dance, and you feel like there's a freedom. And actually, anybody I tried, like Gordon Ryan, one of the best grappler in the world, nogi grappler in the world, there's a feeling like you can do anything, but when you actually try to do something, you can't.
It just magically doesn't work.
But with the best judo players in the world, it does feel like there's a blanket that weighs 1,000 pounds on top of you, and there's not a feeling like you can do anything. You're trapped. And that's a style, that's a difference in the style of martial arts. But it's also, once you start to study, you understand it all has to do with human movement and the physics of it and the leverage and all that kind of stuff. And that's that's super fascinating. At the end of the day, for me, the biggest benefit is in the humbling aspect. When another human being kind of tells you that, there's a hierarchy or there's you're not that special.
Yeah. And in the most extreme case, when you tap to a choke, you are basically living because somebody let you live. And that is one of those, if you think about it, that is a closer brush with mortality than most people consider.
And that kind of humbling act is good to take to your work then, where it's harder to get humbled,
Yeah, because nobody that does any martial art is coming out thinking I'm the best in the world at anything, because everybody loses.
Let me ask you for advice. What advice would you give to young people today about life, about career, how they can have a job, how they can have an impact, how they can have a life they can be proud of?
So it was kind of fun. I got invited to give the commencement speech back at I went to a college for 2 semesters and dropped out and went on to do my tech stuff. But they still wanted me to come back and give a commencement speech. And I've got that pinned on my Twitter account. And I still feel...
Непонятно, как-то странно переводит commencements. Вступление, актовый день, начало. Начало.
Commencement.
Harvard commencement, выпускной в городе. Выпускной. Речь на выпускном, видимо. Окей, видимо. Открытие. Ну да, видимо, речь.
Feel good about everything that I said there. And, my biggest point was that the path for me might not be the path for everyone. And in fact, the advice, the path that I took, and even the advice that I would give based on my experience and learnings, probably isn't the best advice for everyone, because what I did was all about this knowledge in depth. It was about not just having this surface level ability to make things do what I want, but to really understand them through and through, to let me do the systems engineering work and to sometimes find these inefficiencies that can be bypassed. And that the whole world doesn't need that. Most programmers don't need, or engineers of any kind don't necessarily need to do that. They need to do the little job that's been parceled out to them, be reliable, let people depend on you, do quality work with all of that. But people that do have an inclination for wanting to know things deeper and learn things deeper, there are just layers and layers of things out there, and it's amazing. If you're the right person that is excited about that, the world's never been like this before. It's better than ever. I mean, everything that was wonderful for me is still there, and there's whole new worlds to explore on the different things that you can do. And that, it's hard work, embrace the grind with it, and understand as much as you can, and then be prepared for opportunities to present themselves, where you can't just say, this is my goal in life, and just push at that. I mean, you might be able to do that, but you're going to make more total progress if you say, I'm preparing myself with this broad set of tools, and then I'm being aware of all the way things are changing as I move through the world and as the whole world changes around me, and then looking for opportunities to deploy the tools that you've built. And there's going to be more and more of those types of things there, where an awareness of what's happening, where the inefficiencies are, what things can be done, what's possible versus what's current practice, and then finding those areas where you can go and make an adjustment and make something that may affect millions or billions of people in the world, make it better.
When, maybe from your own example, how were you able to recognize this about yourself, that you saw the layers in a particular thing and you were drawn to discovering deeper and deeper truths about it? Is that something that was obvious to you that you couldn't help, or is there some actions you had to take to actually allow yourself to dig deep?
So in the earliest days of personal computers, I remember the reference manuals, and the very early ones even had schematics of computers in the background, in the back of the books, as well as firmware listings and things. And I could look at that, and at that time, when I was a younger teenager, I didn't understand a lot of that stuff, how the different things worked. I was pulling out the information that I could get, but I always wanted to know all of that. There was like kind of magical information sitting down there. It's like the elder lore that some graybeard wizard is the keeper of. And so I always felt that pull for wanting to know more, wanting to explore the mysterious areas there. And, and that followed right in through all the things that got the value, exploring the video cards leading to the scrolling advantages, exploring some of the academic papers and things, learning about BSP trees and the different things that I could do, with those systems, and just the huge larval phases going through aerospace, just reading bookshelves full of books. I mean, again, that point where I have enough money, I can buy all the books I want. It was so valuable there, where I was terrible with my money when I was a kid. My mom thought I would always be broke because, I'd buy my comic books and just be out of money. But it was like all the pizza I want, all the Diet Coke I want, video games, and then books. And it didn't take that much. As soon as I was making $27K a year, I felt rich, and I was just getting all the things that I wanted. But that sense of, books have always been magical to me. And that was one of the things that really made me smile is Andre had said he found, when he came over to my house, he said he found my library inspiring, just that I had. And it was great to see, I still look at him, he's kind of a younger guy. I sometimes wonder if younger people these days have the same relationship with books that I do, where they were such a cornerstone for me in so many ways. But that sense that, I always wanted to know it all. I know I can't. And that was like one of the last things I said. You can't know everything, but you should convince yourself that you can know anything. Any one particular thing, it was created and discovered by humans. You can learn it. You can find out what you need on there.
And you can learn it deeply.
Yeah. You can drive a nail down through whatever layer cake problem space you've got and learn a cross section there.
And not only can you have an impact doing that, you can attain happiness doing that. There's something so fulfilling about becoming a craftsman of a thing.
Yeah, and I don't want to tell people that, look, this is a good career move, just, grit your teeth and bear it. You want people, and I do think it is possible sometimes to find the joy in something. Like, it might not immediately appeal to you, but I had told people early on, like in software times, that, a lot of game developers are in it just because they are so passionate about games. But I was always really more flexible in what appealed to me, where I said, I think I could be quite engaged doing operating system work or even database work. I would find the interest in that because I think most things that are significant in the world have a lot of layers and complexity to them and a lot of opportunities hidden within them. So that would probably be the most important thing to encourage to people is that you can, it's like weaponized curiosity. You can deploy your curiosity to find, to kind of like make things useful and valuable to you, even if they don't immediately appear that way.
Deploy your curiosity. Yeah, that's very true. We've mentioned this debate point, whether mortality or fear of mortality is fundamental to creating an AGI, but let's talk about whether it's fundamental to human beings. Do you think about your own mortality?
I really don't. And you probably always have to like take with a grain of salt anything somebody says about fundamental things like that. But I don't think about really aging, impending death, legacy with my children, things like that. And clearly, it seems most of the world does a lot more than I do.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think I'm an outlier in that where it's. Yeah, it doesn't wind up being a real part of my my thinking and motivation about things.
So daily existence is about sort of the people you love and the problems before you.
I'm very much focused on what I'm working on right now. I do take that back. There's one aspect where the kind of finiteness of the life does impact me, and that is about thinking about the scope of the problems that I'm working on. When I when I decided to work on, when I was like nuclear fission or AGI, these are big ticket things that are impact large fractions of the world. And I was thinking to myself at some level that, okay, I mean, I may have a couple more swings at bat with me at full capability, but yes, my mental abilities will decay with age, mostly inevitably. I don't think it's a 0% chance that we will address some of that before it becomes a problem for me. I think exciting medical stuff in the next couple decades. But I do have this kind of vague plan that when I'm not at the top of my game and I don't feel that I'm, in a position to put a dent in the world some way, that I'll probably wind up doing some kind of recreational retro programming, or I'll work on some, something that I would not devote my life to now, but I can while away my time as the old man gardening in the code worlds.
Нет, все, ждем игру от Кармака тогда, когда ему будет 93. Отлично, супер. Это план. Разберется с AGI, может быть, еще что-то успеет, и потом...
And then to step back even bigger, let me ask you about why we're here, we human beings.
Типа он пушит, давит, чтобы решить супер какие-то проблемы, уже чисто, физически может не справляться. И такой, окей, я знаю, как другие проблемы решать уже попроще, и они не так сильно напрягают, можно их решать. Нормально, что, кстати, прикольно.
What's the meaning of it? Let me ask you about why we're here, we human beings. What's
Real human being. Лучше не ждать.
the meaning of it all? What's the meaning of life, John Carmack? We human beings. Bigger. And then to step back even bigger, let me ask you about why we're here, we human beings. What's the meaning of it all? What's the meaning of life, John Carmack?
So very similar with that last question. I know a lot of people fret about this question a lot, and I just really don't.
I really don't give a damn.
We are biological creatures that happenstance of evolution. We have innate drives that evolution crafted for survival and passing on of genetic codes. I don't find a lot of value in trying to go much deeper than that. I have my motivations, some of which are probably genetically coded, and many of which are contingent on my upbringing and the path that I've had through my life. I don't run into like spates of depression or ennui or anything that winds up being a challenge and forcing a degree of soul searching with things like that. I seem to be okay, kind of without that.
As a brilliant ant in the ant colony.
Короче, Кармак пошел дальше, вознесся выше ДНК и даже мемов.
Without looking up to as a brilliant ant in the ant colony without looking up to the sky, wondering why the hell am I here again?
Yeah.
So the why of it, the incredible.
Усик, Уся я. Ты моего папу Ральфа не видел. Почему его нигде нет? Смотрим 48 часов интервью Магуса и Абабуса. И зачем запись включил? Усь непорядок, Усь.
Спасибо большое. Услышно будет смотреть в 0.5 закреп... Не, закреп.
Mystery of the why of it, the incredible mystery of the fact that we started, first of all, the origin of life on Earth, and from that, from single cell organisms, the entirety of the evolutionary process took us somehow to this incredibly intelligent thing that is able to build Wolfenstein 3D and Doom and Quake and take a crack at the problem of AGI and create things that eventually supersede human beings. That doesn't. The why of it is.
It's been my experience that people that focus on that don't focus on the here and now right in front of them tend to be less effective. I mean, it's not 100%. You know, vision matters to some people, but it doesn't seem to be a necessary motivator for me. And I think that the process of getting there is usually done. Again, it's like the magic of gradient descent.
Yeah.
People just don't believe that just looking locally gets you to all of these spectacular things. That's been, the decades of looking at really some of the smartest people in the world that would just push back forever against this idea that it's not this grand, sophisticated vision of everything, but little tiny steps, local information winds up leading to all the best answers.
So the meaning of life is following locally wherever the gradient descent takes you. This was an incredible conversation, officially the longest conversation I've ever done on the podcast, which means a lot to me because I get to do it with one of my heroes, John. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you would sit down with me. You're an incredible human being. I can't wait what you do next, but you've already changed the world. You're an inspiration to so many people. And again, we haven't covered most of what I was planning to talk about. So I hope we get a chance to talk someday in the future. And I can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you so much again for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with John Carmack. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from John Carmack himself. Focused, hard work is the real key to success. Keep your eyes on the goal. And just keep taking the next step towards completing it. If you aren't sure which way to do something, do it both ways and see which works better. Thank you for listening and hope to see you next time.
Да, Лекс прикольный чел, клево. Я подпишусь. Пускай плюс подписчик будет. Классное интервью, охуеть, очень круто.
I remember the reaction where he had...
Очень круто. 5 часов от Джона Кармаком to get popcorn. Класс. Супер. Поновлення. Так. Бля. Такой стоп-кадр. Так. Заматерил видос. Вообще, да, на самом деле. Я понял, что... во-первых, я еще лучше понял по поводу того, как я делаю свою работу. И я делаю всегда... пытаюсь сделать что-то новое. Также у меня было в роликах. И я помню, что когда я задерживался на чем-то, что мне неинтересно было, оно влияло на качество этой работы, и когда я мог бы потратить уже время на что-то другое и не рефлексировать по поводу чего-то. Поэтому, да, меньше, наверное, сомневаться Нет, ну, наверное, сомневаться в своих решениях это нормально, потому что ты проверяешь, действительно правильно ты там что-то сделал или нет. Сомневаться в себе это понятное дело, это ну, ни в коем случае не стоит, это ничего полезного не приводит. Как это? У меня всегда находится энергия и решение к каким-то вещам, которые я экспериментирую, и мне лучше продолжить заниматься этим, потому что, мне кажется, это моя сильная сторона, и да, я просто это буду делать. Как мы назовем стрим? Я знаю, как мы назовем стрим. Я знаю. Я его назвал. Чувствуешь себя именно в этом теле, почему не другом, почему ты именно существуешь не на 100 лет раньше, позже, почему именно в солнечное приходит закон, получается, душа, призрак, так. Юзи ХДД, вы думаете? Тут странный взгляд у меня, и типа, и сама улыбка, вот это, и она как-то... Не, они не совпадают, понимаете, не совпадают. Ну, спасибо, Делза. Вот вопрос. Ну ладно, окей, ладно, хорошо. Блин, это... окей, уж подумал, уже все, не добавляется ничего. Короче, да, я по поводу реймарчинга вчера узнал, очень забавно получилось, что вот я думал, как я бы по-своему делал рендер и рисовал вещи на экране. Я подумал о кругах почему-то, о волнах и прочее. Мне потом вчера указали на то, что в принципе я говорю о sign distance fields, и это уже как бы играют с этой штукой, с этой идеей, и можно попробовать это изучить. Я немножечко посмотрел, да. И там вроде как все очень просто получается, но почему-то тяжело до этого догнать. По сути, это просто булевая операция. То есть это... Я вот думал о каких-то векторных вещах, как вот векторные мониторы, которые не пиксели выводят на экране.
Срать пасты в чат и в донаты. Я считаю, это моя сильная сторона. Икс-Чичард Ричкин, вы самый красивый мужчина.
Спасибо большое.
Какаам.
Спасибо большое. Да, короче. Но я не совсем понял, что мне нужно почитать, чтобы понять эти вещи. Да, о чем говорю? То, что как векторные мониторы тоже делали, но они не прижились, как бы стали использовать растеризацию, то есть пикселями отображать картинку. Но как бы есть форматы даже файлов, да, что ты, какие картинки ты можешь отображать, например, векторный формат или растеризированный формат, и по сути эти sign distance fields это тоже своего рода как бы такая аналогия, как на 2D-шные, то есть векторный и растеризированный формат, и sign distance fields это векторный формат как раз таки. Почему про SDF заговорил? Я просто подумал о том, что я бы, наверное, не хотел... то есть, если бы я делал рендер, я бы делал, наверное, его по-другому, не так, как он обычно делается, просто из-за того, что мне не очень нравится так, как он обычно делается. Из-за своей... Я бы даже не сказал, что комплексности, наверное, запутанности. Типа, что можно проще, короче. Типа, это уже делали. Типа, зачем? Можно что-то другое попробовать. И у меня было ощущение, что можно как-то это по-другому делать. Как выяснилось, вот потихоньку что-то, как бы, к этому люди уже немножечко пытались сделать. Painting a character with maths. А это как раз-таки про... это шейдер той объясняет тот самый код на шейдер той, или это кто-то поясняет за этот код? А Cartoon Character Support Channel 2020 код. Будем новеллу? Я просто подумал, как идея. Они неэффективны, да, но я просто подумал, а чё бы... Компьютеры так быстрые, чё бы не поиграться и не найти более короткий путь, если есть такая возможность, потому что нынешние способы, нынешняя техника основывается на ограничениях 40-летней давности, и типа можно просто сказать, окей, это я отрежу, попробую по-другому подумать уже о том, что как бы, какое железо я сейчас могу использовать, как я могу играться. Inigo Quiles, маг волшебника из DF. Please visit my landing page in the first video. Тут типа материалы собраны по поводу этого, нихуя себе. То есть это вот эти истории про то, что, окей, мы собрали, типа, рендерятся всякие разные вещи, там используется совсем мало памяти. Это вот отсюда ноги растут. Meat license. Meat license unknown? Это лицензия, которая означает делайте, что хотите? Типа того. Прикольная лицензия. Вулкан? Я понял, в принципе, как мы связываемся с видеокартой. Мне не интересно, как графический API. Меня интересует графический API просто в скорости. Не в скорости, сейчас, на данный момент, То есть Вулкан, он больше про задачку, про мультиплатформенность. То есть он такую задачку скорее решает. Если я хотел бы производительности, я бы взял DirectX, потому что я собираюсь работать на Windows. Но по итогу я просто взял OpenGL, потому что просто больше обучающего материала. И просто быстрее... Короче, мне меньше нужно кода написать, чтобы выводить фигню на экране. Вот и все. Вот. Да, эффективнее было бы что другой способ, тоже DirectX, но... То есть я понимаю, что OpenGL там это не лучше и все такое, но я специально принял это решение, понимаю, что я делаю. Indices of useful functions, процедурный noise detection, filtering, fractals. Окей, тут разные типы техники и способы использования. Useful maths. Density visibility. Да, тут много всего. Где входная точка? Вот входную точку можно было бы посмотреть. Вот что интересно.
Несколько отступлений в абстракцию математическую.
О, нет. Он как бы штука... Да нет, зачем его, типа, писать про алкоголика? Красиво. Это метрическое пространство. Это относится к линейной алгебре? Окей. Интервью было 5 часов, да. Sculpting a face. Код был бы определенно попроще, чем математические символы. Я, конечно, лайк поставлю, но это немного не то. Спасибо большое.